In 1989, the CCP did something that shocked the entire world. China's democracy protests were threatening the CCP's rule. It made them scared. So scared that the CCP decided to launch an attack against its own citizens to silence the protests. In the process, thousands of innocent Chinese students were killed, and thousands more were wounded. In the last few weeks, something similar has been happening in China that is scaring the CCP. Chinese citizens across the country took to social media to do something that has never been done before. Thousands of would-be homeowners pushed for a movement to stop paying mortgages on their homes, in an attempt to put pressure on the CCP and banks to treat them fairly. Protests broke out in multiple cities, and the crusade seems to be gaining more and more momentum each day. The CCP is so worried that it has already sent out tanks to maintain stability. For the first time in more than 30 years, the CCP is fearing for its existence, and it all has to do with China's real estate bubble. According to one expert, the CCP sees this situation as a political protest, not a banking crisis. Government officials are extremely fearful about how this might turn out.
But one country could already be facing a recession, and that is China.
A massive protest over frozen bank deposits.
Hundreds gathered in Zhengzhou,
Tens of thousands of them have begun withholding payments,
demanding compensation. Before long, thousands of security personnel appeared,
accusing the local police of using violence.
Big Chinese banks are at risk. Over $9 trillion in loans are at danger of defaults, and if the situation gets any worse, this could foretell the collapse of China and the CCP. This mortgage crisis isn't the only crisis the CCP is dealing with. As covered in my previous videos, zero-COVID policies and bank deposit scams in Henan pose a big risk to China's fragile economy too. But this mortgage situation is by far the biggest threat, as it affects trillions of dollars, involves some of the most important industries like banking and real estate, and influences millions of households in the country. According to a well-respected expert, this mortgage crisis could be 100 times worse than the 2008 financial crisis. So to keep the news under wraps, the CCP censors are working overtime to censor any articles and videos that spread the truth. Now, I have my suspicions that the CCP's bots have always been disliking my China videos in order to suppress it in the algorithm. So if you guys can just take a quick second of your time and tap that like button below, it helps me out a lot with the YouTube algorithm, especially when covering topics that are critical of the CCP. Even though the protests started in July, the problems have been brewing for China's real estate market for decades. So, before jumping into how these protests are threatening the CCP's rule, let's first go over how the Chinese economy got to where it is now. Here in Uncle Sam's America, it's considered to be an important part of the American dream to own a home. But slowly, it's getting less popular among newer generations to do so because, well, it's not very affordable. China, on the other hand, is different. The importance of owning a house has only gone up in the past couple of decades. Real estate is one of the asset classes that the public trusts more than anything. And real estate ownership has been a very important cultural significance to the Chinese people. Families use real estate as a way to plan for their retirement. Guys with real estate are considered attractive choices for marriage, and the amount of real estate you own is directly related to your social status in society. Considering all this, you can see why real estate prices have continued rising over time. If you want to learn more about the cultural and economic significance of real estate in China, Polymatter has a great video on this, which I will link below. There's a high demand for real estate because of all these factors. And coupled with incredible price rises in the past, you can see why everyone and their mother wants to buy a home. Kind of reminds me of the 2008 US housing market, where everyone wants to buy real estate because real estate prices are only going up. The rush to buy houses was so huge that the developers were selling out complexes before even breaking ground for construction. However, even after construction finished, apartments just sat there empty because they had owners but no habitants. Demand was high because everyone wants to buy their second or third home to get rich on the real estate boom, so supply increased drastically to match the demand. But a lot of these homes were just sitting empty, as owners were only buying these homes in hopes of price appreciation. Because other asset sectors weren't as accessible and developed, real estate was the only thing people invested in. Based on one data set, Chinese families had around 70% of their wealth in real estate. Yes, you heard that right, 70%. They're not much for diversification. Oh, just imagine if something happened to the real estate market. All right, I think I'm laying on the foreshadowing a little too thick.
The collapse of Chinese property giant Evergrande unfolds. Shares in the highly indebted company have fallen 80% this year. And
15 towers unfinished for 7 years. The developer bankrupt. These towers were recently brought down in Shanghai after 20 years of stalled construction.
Evergrande took full advantage of this boom in China's real estate market and became one of the largest developers in the country. At one point in 2018, they were actually the biggest real estate company in Asia. When people look at something that big, well, they kind of just assume it's all legitimate. Oftentimes, though, that's not really the case. I hope you guys learned that lesson after the 2008 crisis. If anyone had looked under the hood, they would have realized that some of the practices happening at Evergrande were far from appropriate. Now, due to the sheer scale of the company, a lot of practices were quite complicated, but here's my attempt at trying to simplify this. Remember earlier how I mentioned that FOMO into real estate was so bad that people were buying houses before construction even began? Usually, a company like Evergrande would lease a piece of land from the local government. Then they would turn around and sell the houses that are supposed to be built there and receive full payment for the houses before even breaking ground. Companies would never have any issue selling out as the demand for real estate was so high. People were more than happy to take out mortgages and buy houses just in hopes of owning real estate someday in the future. Now, the big problem that starts here is that companies like Evergrande wouldn't usually use the money from the sale to start construction. No, instead they would use the money as down payment to buy even more land, so they can sell even more apartments for the future. Now, this is already a huge problem. This should not have been allowed in the first place. Any unbiased person can look at the system and figure out that this isn't gonna last. This is exactly the job of the CCP, but they passed on this responsibility to the local governments. And this is where another problem lies. Local governments were directly benefiting from these real estate pyramid schemes that companies like Evergrande had going on. You see, in China, one of the big ways local governments make money is by leasing land to developers, like Evergrande. This meant that the more risk these property developers took on, the higher the bids on this land that the government was leasing out. Around 50% of local government's revenue was coming from leasing out land. The same government that should be protecting its citizens from these risky practices is benefiting heavily from these so-called risky practices. This is a prime example of perverse incentives. We don't even need to get into the corruption that goes on around these land leases. This was one of the main reasons why China's real estate bubble has gotten so big. Regulators were always slow to step in because it was directly benefiting them. The CCP saw where things were heading and tried to get things under control by implementing the 3 red line policies for property developers. But it was a little too late.
The debt burden continues to weigh on China's Evergrande Group as its angry suppliers are protesting the developer's unpaid bills while its bondholders' patience has dissipated.
The shady practices don't just stop there either. Evergrande would list these houses as assets under their balance sheet to get more loans from the banks so they can finish construction. These houses were already sold to other people, so no matter what accounting magic you use, these can't be considered assets of Evergrande. The worst part is that Evergrande wasn't the only one pulling these shady tricks. Almost every real estate company in China was operating this way. The whole sector was over-leveraged to the teeth. Just like a Ponzi scheme, the only way to continue forever is if you continue growing forever. But you can't keep growing if people lose trust in Evergrande's ability to stay solvent. And I'm sure you guessed it by now, that's exactly what happened. Once the company misses one payment, chaos ensues. Early last year, one of Evergrande's subsidiary companies failed to make a payment on its loans, and people started looking deeper into its financials. This is when the house of cards started crumbling, and the news about contagions spread across the world.
The debt burden continues to weigh on China's Evergrande Group.
China's top real estate developer, Evergrande, is reeling under a financial crunch.
Meanwhile, in China, the debt crisis at Evergrande is only snowballing.
And there's so many questions surrounding Evergrande.
In a notice circulating on social media, the suppliers have demanded payment from Evergrande.
Evergrande.
As Evergrande's debt crisis deepens, small business owners and people waiting for homes to be completed are starting to despair.
These investors were lured in with various promises
to demand the developer to give them their money back. The protests made authorities nervous.
When the news got out that Evergrande could default on $300 billion worth of loans, panic spread throughout the economy. People also realized that this problem isn't limited to Evergrande. The whole real estate sector is over-leveraged, and it's starting to crumble. Chinese developers owed around $5.3 trillion in debt. When the CCP realized just how big the problem was, they decided to step in and soften the blow back in 2021. Ever since then, Evergrande and other real estate developers have been chugging along slowly with the help of the CCP. And by slowly, I mean like a snail's pace. Construction of buildings sold in 2019 are still not done. All the funds from new sales are basically going towards paying off companies' liabilities instead of actually finishing up projects. This is just one example of unfinished projects that had to be demolished because of problems from the delay in construction. Whenever owners of these houses would ask about construction delays, they were just met with excuse after excuse. Slowly, things just got to be too much. Some of these citizens had their whole life savings invested in these unfinished projects, and they just couldn't take it anymore. So, on July 1st, all of the homebuyers from a project in central China published a letter saying that they would stop paying their mortgage payments to the bank unless the construction restarts. Now, a project usually includes thousands of houses and are worth upwards of hundreds of millions of dollars. But at the end of the day, it was just one project in a nation of 1.6 billion people, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But it didn't stop at just that one project. By the same evening, home buyers from another such project had announced the same mortgage boycott, and the movement started to spread across the nation. By July 12th, 100 projects had joined the boycott. And as of the writing of this script, over 300 projects across China are boycotting mortgage payments until construction resumes. Tens of thousands of people have willingly defaulted on their mortgages in hopes of getting the government's attention. People have also taken to the street to protest these construction delays. Currently, these 300 projects represent more than $100 billion of debt that China's big banks are holding. When you factor in that some major developers also defaulted last year on their debt, this is not a good sign for China's banking institutions. What's even more concerning for banks and the government is not just $100 billion in possible default, but the growing number of people who are joining in on the boycott. The CCP has already ordered banks and news organizations to stop publishing reports about mortgage boycotts. Party officials are doing everything they can to kill this news. These boycotts represent an existential crisis for Chinese banks, a crisis that has the potential to be 100 times worse than what American banks faced in 2008. One of the big differences between 2008 and the current situation in China is that the majority of these loans are collateralized by houses that are not yet built. So banks can't just repossess the house when someone defaults and cuts their losses. Banks are being forced to eat these losses, and if the defaults keep growing, there's a chance that big banks might fold. One of the big 4 state banks in China has already limited people's withdrawals. I'm sure most of you already know how the modern banking system works, but here's a quick overview for everyone else. Banks usually loan the money that depositors deposit and hope to earn interest on it to make a profit. Usually the reserve requirement is set by the central banks. Let's say that it's 10%. That means that whenever banks get $100 in deposits, they are only required to keep $10 in the vault, and they can loan out $90 and charge interest on it. So this is just a very simplified example, but these types of transactions happen millions of times over and over again in an economy, and that's basically how the modern banking system works. For every $100 in deposits, banks are able to create about $1,000 of money in circulation. Now, this system is pretty great. In the past century, a lot of economic growth is in part thanks to this fractional reserve banking. But the only way this system works is if depositors have trust in the bank's ability to keep their money safe. Now, if too many of these loans that banks are giving out become worthless, then that trust starts to erode. This is why the USA enacted strict lending regulations after the 2008 crisis, so banks are careful with who they lend to. Now, as more and more homebuyers are defaulting on their loans, Chinese banks are also at risk of losing the trust of the depositors. Putting limits on the withdrawals definitely does not help with building that trust. If too many people start pulling out their deposits from the banks, then a bank run happens and banks collapse because of it. This is where the big headache lies for the CCP. The Chinese economy is heavily reliant on its financial sector and the real estate sector. Real estate represents around 30% of China's GDP, while 7 out of the top 10 companies in China are financial institutions. This is why, as the news about these boycotts spread, the CCP held an emergency meeting with the banks to discuss the rising risk of these defaults. To help the struggling developers, the CCP is considering injecting more than $1 trillion into real estate companies so that they can finish off construction with these projects. Remember last year when the Evergrande news came out? The CCP was strictly against bailing out failing companies as they didn't want to promote risky business behavior in China. But now that they're realizing that this has the potential to tank the government, CCP officials are changing their tone when it comes to bailouts. The CCP has also stepped up the censoring around this topic, in hopes of stopping more people from joining the boycotts and protests. As mentioned earlier, the CCP sees this situation as a political protest, not a banking crisis. Government officials are extremely fearful about how this might turn out. I'm guessing they will do anything in their power to suppress any news around this topic. Usually my China videos are heavily disliked by Chinese bots to hurt them in the YouTube algorithm. So again, if you guys can take a second to scroll down and hit that like button, it means the world to me, as these videos, they take a lot of time to make. Currently, we don't have that much info as to what the CCP plans to do as the news is still developing, but as soon as I have more info, I will have a video out ASAP.
China, the factory of the world.
The world's most populous country is facing a crisis.
China's population is aging. Fertility rates are at an all-time low.
Gender imbalance in China.
Rapidly rising number of older people in the population.
It does not have young people to man its factories or join its army.
China is facing a crisis, threatening to end the nation as we know it in the coming few years. China's population crisis has gone from a social worry to a government emergency, as the population decline now begins to affect industry and commerce in the Eastern Giant. While many countries struggle with overpopulation, China, the world's most populated country with more than 1.4 billion people, has a different problem. Their population crisis manifests in that the citizens of the Dragon of the East are just not having enough, fun time. Yes, low birth rates are the bane of the nation. And these low birth rates might be what spells doom for the nation. In this video, I will explain 1. How low birth rates became a problem to begin with, and 2. The social and economic implications on China as a result. Let's proceed.
The rise of China is the biggest event in the recent economic history in the world. So within 30 years, in terms of growth rate of total GDP, China has break the record.
The biggest jump in GDP since China started keeping quarterly records in 1992. That is a very, very impressive figure. China seems to leave everyone else behind.
China's race to become the #1 economy, the output of what is now the world's #2 economy, is expected to surpass that of the US.
The Chinese economy is going to be probably at least twice as big as the US economy.
But, believe it or not, China has a population problem. The number of babies being born is going down.
China's population is aging. Seniors over 65 will make up a full third of the nation's population.
Well, we are about to witness a demographic crisis in China.
The seeds of China's present destruction began as a very different issue decades ago. In the late 1900s, China found itself facing a giant problem on its hands: overpopulation. The way the population was growing versus the agricultural output coming out of late 1900s China meant that such levels of population growth were simply unsustainable. In a bid to avoid hunger rampage across the nation, China decided to implement a very drastic set of policies, the most widely known being the one-child policy. Under this policy, families were limited to having only one child. The goal was that by limiting the number of children in every family to one, it would lead to fewer mouths to feed, and ultimately a more balanced population. This worked wonders, as the birth rate plummeted heavily over the decades that followed, so much so that it not only achieved its intended targets, but it then created a culture that has led China into the depths of despair that it is now in. But what the CCP didn't realize was that they were creating a problem for the future generation. You see, because of the one-child policy, theoretically, every couple or two people are only leaving behind one child, which is not enough to replace themselves. That's why the replacement birth rate is considered around 2.1 kids. 2 kids to replace each of the parents, and 0.1 for any unfortunate child deaths. Since the one-child policy didn't take this into account, it was just too powerful at slowing down the population growth. Talk about too effective of a solution. As a result of reduced birth rates, part of the problem with China's population is that it's aging out. As most of the population is approaching, or is in, retirement age, this creates quite the complex. Low birth rates and an aging population? Yikes. Let's look at the problems that come from that. Problems that are leading China into its destruction in the modern day.
The ruling Communist Party says it is scrapping a strict two-child policy in response to the rapidly rising number of older people in the population. Beijing has enforced birth limits for 4 decades, but it's now concerned that a demographic crisis could add to pressure on its economy.
China's population grew by only 480,000 last year. That was the lowest in 60 years.
In absolute numbers, there are 33 million more men than women in China today. The gender imbalance in China is most severe in rural farmlands.
For those who engineered the single-child policy, the gender imbalance has been the worst unintended consequence.
The first social problem that can be easily identified as one takes a walk in the streets of China is that, as a result of the one-child policy,
it began in 1980. Only one child allowed.
Decades of families without brothers or sisters.
These harsh measures did reduce the number of births.
Decades, right, for the population to rebound.
A symbolic example of state control.
The one-child policy.
The one-child policy.
The one-child policy.
China has an extreme gender imbalance. as the nation has far more males than females. This formed as a result of parents favoring having male children to carry on the family name and bloodline over having female children. Practiced over generations, it seems that the effects are now in full bloom, as China has over 37 million more males than women. As simple as this sounds, this creates a whole host of social and cultural issues that affect the nation heavily. To begin with, China has a problem of bare branches, especially in rural China. This is a Chinese term for men who are single and are unlikely to find a wife in the future. As their presence in the rural landscape has grown, bare branches have increasingly attracted the concern of China's policymakers. In January of 2007, the Central Committee and State Council issued a report saying that the imbalance in the marriage market amounted to a hidden danger for society and will affect social stability. The government's anxiety over the surplus men is more or less buttressed by a growing body of research linking marginalized men to the likely spread of violent crimes, prostitution, sexually transmitted infections, and the trafficking of women. Several studies have drawn a connection between the historical outbreaks of peasant rebellions in China and surplus males. As we all know, the CCP is not a big fan of rebellion of any kind, so this creates a problem for them. Adding to the social problems that are being caused by China's population crisis, you will find that the gender imbalance is creating a high competition in marriage for the few females available. Chinese matchmakers always have more men than women, which means a lot of men go unmarried into old age. This further creates a disproportion in the birth rate, and it has also resulted in the thriving of online communities where young men spend money on females to find closure and comfort. This activity contributes to the collapse of Chinese morality and tradition in society. Consider this. China's population grew to 1.41 billion in the decade ending in 2020. Its lowest rate of growth since imposing a strict one-child-per-family policy in the 1980s. The National Bureau of Statistics announced that China added 72 million people between 2010 and 2020, an increase of 5.38%, with annual growth averaging 0.53%. As these statistics show, the population crisis in China is only getting worse. Where it becomes an economic problem is that a good portion of China's active workforce is aging, but there aren't enough youngsters to replace them in jobs all over the nation. This creates vacancies in key sectors all over the country, and because there's no manpower, economic growth slows down. As you can imagine, this is the last thing that China wants as it fights to surpass the US definitively in several metrics. The sector that has been affected the most by this labor shortage has been the manufacturing industry, as there is not enough manpower to man the industries in comparison to the past. On the other hand, certain analysts have argued that there's not so much a universal labor shortage as there is a mismatch in labor. The younger generation is shying away from manual jobs like farming and industrial work, which makes up a significant part of the economy. This, therefore, leaves a gaping hole in the labor pool, leading to the same problem: vacancies and slow economic growth. But labor shortages aren't the full scope of the problems that come with China's population aging problem. Other factors exist that are equally as puzzling to solve for the government. The reality of the situation, confirmed by the results of China's most recent census, shows that the silver generation is China's fastest growing demographic. This demographic of senior people accounts for 1/3 of the country's purchasing, a fact that merchants and retailers are becoming aware of and factoring for. With growing spending power, more leisure time, and longer life expectancy, Chinese seniors are becoming a consumer group to be reckoned with. Given their growing will to live their golden years to the fullest, and taking into consideration how nuanced this huge cohort is, brands can create and communicate their products and services properly. China's population of people over 60 years old surpassed 254 million in 2019, accounting for 18.1% of the total population. No other country in the world faces such a significant demographic change. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, China's aging population will reach 330 million by 2030, accounting for 1/4 of the overall population. What this means in economic terms is that there will be a whole portion of China's population that will be retired and not actively contributing to the growth of the economy. Analysts have stated that the demographic dependency ratio, which is a measure of the dependence on a society's total working population, would go from 47% in 2019 to 96% in 2050. What this means is that in the not-so-distant future for China, for every retiree, there will be only one person working. This will undoubtedly put pressure on China's economy, as there will be a strain to take care of the retired population. Extra burdens will be placed on the benefits and the healthcare system, resulting in increased costs all around. Current estimates state that in 2027, retirement funds will peak at 7 trillion yuan, but then go to zero by 2035 due to the number of dependents increasing. As a result, a notable deficit will be felt between its inflows and expenses, monetary-wise, and by 2050, the deficit will be in the trillions of yuans. The difficulties in maintaining the liquidity of the pension system are forcing the government to take extreme measures, like attempting to encourage more births and increasing the retirement age. But it might all be a little too late at this point. The government is not oblivious to the problems being faced in China. In fact, the CCP, realizing the trouble that China is in, has long since instituted a two-child policy. In May 2021, the Chinese government announced it would scrap that policy in favor of a three-child policy, allowing couples to have 3 children to try and increase the declining birth rates. This followed 2020, where the birth rate fell 15% to record a dismal 10 million births. In addition, China has started to try and address the low manpower problem by moving towards technological trends and trying to use technology and innovation to supplement the industrial sector. Basically, China is trying to transition the economy from being labor-intensive to a technological one. But it's key to note that the industrial sector constitutes 38% of the overall economy. And until full automation, the labor shortages will be felt in the present moment and for many years to come. These measures, at this point, just seem like desperate attempts to resolve a problem that is now far more than skin deep. After generations of the one-child policy, there are now facets of the Chinese economy that are so deeply ingrained that it will take decades to reverse the effects. The question, much like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, is what will come first? The destruction of China or the rebirth of the nation? China is crumbling. Protests are spreading against the banks. People are getting sick of the government's incompetence. The CCP is so afraid that it has brought out tanks to maintain stability. 2022 is not being kind to the Chinese economy. We are just halfway through the year, but the Chinese economy is already burning and crashing on various levels. What once seemed to be a composed country with everything in order is beginning to show its vulnerabilities as nothing more than a crumbling house of cards. A nation built on pillars of sand. Initial GDP growth projections for the nation have been revised to 4.3% in 2022, almost 1% less than the last projections from December. The question becomes, as the world's second largest economy, the largest by some measures, starts tumbling down, what does that mean for the rest of the world? Or better yet, in what is already a trying year for the markets, what does China's economic collapse mean for you and your financial interests? Let's answer all that in today's video, which is sponsored by Masterworks. More on them later. This is the video I made a few months ago. detailing just how bad China's economic situation was then. I highly recommend you check it out to get a comprehensive picture, but here's a quick recap on the matter. Multiple pillars of China's economy are all crumbling at the same time, and this is having an exhausting effect on the economy. With GDP projections continually shrinking and severe outrage at home, it's hard to see a way out for the Asian giant. Since I made that video, several of these issues have grown in magnitude. And not just that, but new problems have arisen for China. Problems that have far-reaching effects with the potential to affect your finances in America, and investments all over the globe in general. Let's take a look at these factors. Covering China is always a risky move on YouTube, especially when it comes to showing protests. My last 2 videos were demonetized because YouTube deemed it controversial. On top of that, the CCP is notorious for sending its bots to dislike any videos that are critical of China. Fortunately, you guys have shown insane support over my last 2 videos. So, I have the same request again. If you guys can just scroll down real quick and hit that like button, it helps me out tremendously.
China's in chaos right now, apparently, in terms of slowing economic growth.
The entire real estate market in China is a disaster waiting to happen.
To China now, where home buyers, furious at the delayed completion of their properties that they're already paying for, have taken things into their own hands.
Imagine a first world country getting to a point where real estate development companies are becoming so desperate that they institute a barter trade system to sell homes. This is the case with a few real estate developers in the eastern provinces of China. To stimulate sales of properties in the face of what is predicted to be a 25% decline in property sales, the developers are now accepting payments in watermelon, garlic, and sometimes even peaches. Yeah, you heard me right. Down payments for apartments and houses can now be made with produce. This, if nothing else, summarizes the desperation that is China's economic situation. You see, China's real estate market is in a slump that was kicked off last year by Evergrande's debt default. Over-indebted developers have since been reined in through the red line policies, which have tightened leverage requirements, but this hasn't really solved the entire problem. Since Evergrande, other property developers, including Shinmao and Sunac China Holdings, have also missed debt repayment deadlines. This sign of overbearing debt is now threatening to topple down the industry, which is responsible for almost 30% of China's entire GDP. Imagine that. To shore up the sector, regulators recently reduced the loan market quoted rate. In addition, local governments have been advised to implement their real estate policies according to their needs. For example, some local governments, such as Shanghai, have reduced purchase restrictions on homebuyers. Both Tier 1 cities, such as Beijing and Shanghai, and Tier 2 cities, such as Suzhou and Jiangsu, have lowered mortgage rates. These local government policies have frequently been used to boost or dampen real estate activity. Although these measures will ease some major indicators, such as property sales and prices, these rules do not necessarily resolve the issues faced by over-indebted developers. They're just throwing buckets of water onto a wildfire. Many developers are struggling to repay their debts amid COVID-19 lockdowns and dwindling demand. These measures also fail to address the underlying issues behind excessive property development. That is why the real estate sector in China keeps getting worse, with new developments making things more unbearable.
The crisis that began with Evergrande real estate defaulting last year is now snowballing into a bigger crisis.
You know, one by one, we have seen these pillars of China's property cycle crumble.
Not only are home buyers refusing to pay their mortgages, developers' bonds are plummeting.
After the Evergrande fears slipped into the market along with the troubles that developers are facing due to too much debt, angry homebuyers have begun threatening to stop their mortgage payments on unfinished projects. This movement, which gained traction on social media, is now developing quite the following, enough for Beijing to take notice of it. In China, more than 85% of Chinese houses are sold through pre-sale, up from about 50% in 2005. Mortgages begin months or even years before buildings are finished. However, as projects have slowed since 2020 due to the COVID pandemic, along with liquidity issues that have soon followed, it seems that developers won't be able to honor their agreements, and thus the mobs are amassing. As homeowners continue to refuse to pay mortgages for unfinished projects, the movement keeps growing larger, with what was once a list that started with just 30 projects growing to more than 300 at present. The danger in this lies in that the movement against the pre-sale system puts as much as $350 billion in payments at risk. If all these people default, you can expect a scenario that is far worse than the Evergrande crisis to arise. Chinese authorities are aware of this wildfire danger and have already moved to censor it in a bid to prevent havoc, but the movement is gaining traction very quickly as it feeds on itself in a circle. As developers' cash flow dries up, even more projects are being suspended, which then validates the worries and leaves more consumers angry and fearful that they may never be finished. The longer this cycle goes on, the more trouble China's real estate market gets into. Now, think of this. If property in general makes up 30% of China's GDP, how catastrophic will the damage be if the people start defaulting on payments?
China's foreign policy has taken an aggressive turn this year.
It says its military will not sit idly by if Washington's number 3 official visits the island.
China is the bank, Africa is the customer, and Foreign Minister Wang Yi is the caller.
Is one of the only major governments that has yet to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine.
Since it started earlier this year, China's tacit support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only fueled speculation over Beijing's intentions with Taiwan, raising questions about how the world might react should China launch an attack. This kind of speculation, and being on edge, has not been good for the Chinese economy, as its partners do not have full faith in China's policy, particularly towards Taiwan. For a country that is big on trade, this does not bode well. China's plan to invade Taiwan and reassert its dominance over the island nation has never been a secret. China wants to assimilate the nation into the mainland, rhetoric that sounds dangerously close to Putin's propaganda with Ukraine. Even though a full invasion is yet to happen, there is a constant threat of its possibility, and this alone keeps not just Taiwan, but the rest of the world on its toes. This is a problem because Taiwan has fostered relations with some of the biggest economies in the world. Not least among them is the United States. China's authoritarian turn under leader Xi Jinping and plummeting relations with Washington have pulled Taiwan closer to the arms of the USA. This has infuriated Beijing, spurring it to unleash more pressure on Taiwan and sending diplomatic relations on a downward spiral. This situation has become so dangerously delicate that the Quad Summit in Tokyo that was held at the end of May, United States President Joe Biden suggested that any attempt by China to invade Taiwan will result in American military action. Coming from the mouth of the leader of the free world, that is quite the threat. It serves to emphasize just how badly China's policy is antagonizing its trade partners, the effects of which reflect on China economically. The last time the US and China tussled under the Trump administration, there were a lot of economic restrictions and sanctions that heavily slowed down economic growth. This is something that China simply can't afford right now, given the fact that it's already in a precarious position. The US is not the only trade partner that China's foreign policy is antagonizing either. Other nations like the United Kingdom are also included there, hence increasing the list of potential retaliatory forces. At the G7 summit in Madrid, the UK's Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, recently warned China, saying,
I do think that with China extending its influence through economic coercion and building a capable military, there is a real risk that they draw the wrong idea, which results in a catastrophic miscalculation, such as invading Taiwan. And that is exactly what we saw in the case of Ukraine, a strategic miscalculation by Putin.
Using Taiwan as an example, Truss argued that NATO needed to have a global perspective that included democracies outside of its membership. To protect the Pacific, she said, we need to anticipate dangers in the Indo-Pacific, working with friends like Japan and Australia. We must ensure that democracies like Taiwan can defend themselves. We must ensure the self-defense of democracies like Taiwan. These are all strong words from powerful nations. For a nation like China to suffer internal economic complications and external economic hostility simultaneously will be a blow. If their aggressive policies continue, China's economic collapse will be accelerated, well, at a pretty alarming rate. If President Biden's words are to be taken at face value, military action involving the United States is bound to drag the global economy with it. This is definitely something that will affect your financial plans without a doubt. And all that heavily weighs on China's actions.
看到没？大伙儿看到没？各界媒体啊，中央的爷爷奶奶们，你们看一看，都有暴力机关，那些警察把我们合理维权的嘱咐。这些人，你看他们，这还是中国的天吗？这还是中国吗？救救这些老百姓，救救这些储户吧！
Adding fuel to the China economic fire are the small local banks in the Henan region of China. As I've already discussed extensively in my previous videos, Chinese banks are in a delicate position. Citizens are starting to lose trust in the banking infrastructure and the CCP's ability to protect them from a scam. You see, China is unique in a sense that it has a lot of people. So even though a small percent of its population live in rural areas, it still amounts to hundreds of millions of people. To serve these sectors of the population, China has over 4,000 independent banks in rural areas. One of the big problems with having such a fragmented banking system is that these banks are highly susceptible to bankruptcy if anything goes wrong. In order to fight for survival, rural banks will try to skirt banking laws by accepting deposits online by offering relatively high interest rates when compared to big banks. High rates worked, and bank deposits grew at an exponential rate. The only problem here is that these banks were lying to their customers. Customers were led to believe that they were getting a 4% interest rate from a regular savings account. Not bad. But in reality, they were depositing their money in investment products. Big difference here is that money in savings accounts is safe and guaranteed by the CCP in case a bank goes down, while money in investment products carry risk and is in no way guaranteed by the CCP in the event of a bank run. On top of all this lying, these four banks were not acting in accordance with how a bank should act. They were letting one of their investors have full access to depositors' money, and the investing company had complete reign over how to use that money. So the worst happened, and one of the chairmen of the investing company ran away with $6 billion of depositors' money. Depositors only caught on to this because when they went to withdraw their money, the banks would just give them the runaround. This seemed extremely fishy, so some depositors traveled across provinces to go to the bank's office, only to find out that their money wasn't there. This is when they organized their protests to bring attention to the incompetence of regulators. How can banking officials let banks get away with false advertising? How is there no oversight over how banks are using depositors' funds? Where did our $6 billion go? As the protests picked up steam, the risk of bank runs spread all over China. More news that is also coming out of this situation is that this might not be unique to these four banks. This could be the norm in most rural banks in China. When you couple this with the mortgage boycotts that we discussed earlier, China's banks are very close to a liquidity crisis. If trust between the citizens and the banks is not restored soon, it could push China's financial sector down a dangerous spiral. I hope you guys found this news useful. If you disagree with YouTube's judgment about considering these videos controversial, please hit that like button below. It will help my videos reach more people and let YouTube know that they might be wrong about demonetizing videos about China. And since YouTube has been demonetizing our videos, we've launched membership and a Patreon, where you can watch these videos uncensored and support the channel. Lastly, if you want to learn more details about China's banking issues, you can watch the video here.
While most of the world is grappling with inflation, China seems to be experiencing an altogether different challenge: deflation. A nation that was once the epitome of rapid growth and expansion is now facing stumbling blocks that are sending shockwaves through its $18 trillion economy. Deflation is a term that might sound a bit confusing at first, but we'll break it down for you. Think of deflation as the opposite of inflation. Inflation is when prices for things like goods and services go up over time. Deflation, on the other hand, is when those prices actually start to decrease. Now, while this might initially make you feel like your money can buy more, it's important to realize that deflation isn't always a positive sign. Deflation can be a signal of economic trouble. When prices fall too much and too quickly, it can lead to a chain reaction of problems. Businesses might struggle to sell their products because people start waiting for even lower prices. As a result, businesses might earn less money and might even need to cut jobs to stay afloat. This in turn can lead to fewer people spending money, which can eventually slow down the economy. Before the emergence of COVID-19, China was facing a big change in its population. In the years before 2021, the number of babies being born dropped by a staggering 40%. This is really important effects, and we can't ignore them. This situation is also connected to China's past policy called the one-child policy, which influenced the number of children families could have. Key to a strong economy is how people spend their money, but with fewer young adults entering the stage of buying homes, cars, and raising families, the foundation of economic vitality gets shaky. China had trouble keeping up with how much people were buying compared to how much they were making. They thought more people would buy things after COVID-19, but that didn't happen. And then unexpectedly, there were problems with trading between countries, which led to an overabundance of goods both in China and abroad. In July, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, gives us a sneak peek into how consumer goods are priced. It's like a thermometer for inflation. The recent news from China is that the CPI has fallen by 0.3% year on year. That's less than it was this time last year. The Producer Price Index fell for the 10th consecutive month, down 4.4%, a sharper decrease than anticipated. In more simple terms, stuff like food, clothing, and transportation is becoming cheaper. Now, this might sound like a bargain, but it's actually a red flag for the Chinese economy. When prices drop, people tend to buy less, and when demand falls, it ripples through the economy. Here's the domino effect. Falling demand means factories produce less, and that's where things start to get tricky. Fewer goods produced means fewer jobs created. Layoffs become all too common, and investments start to dwindle. It's a snowball effect that leads to economic stagnation. Unlike other economies heavily reliant on consumption and exports, China's growth engine has long been fueled by investment, facilitated by massive borrowing for infrastructure and industrial projects. Using money for investments to make the economy grow can't last forever. The problem is that China has nearly used up all the ways to make more things efficiently. This means that the benefits from investing are getting smaller, which has created a difficult economic problem that needs new and creative solutions. Recent trade figures for July, revealing a decline in both exports and imports, further amplify concerns. However, the Chinese authorities are downplaying the notion of deflation, asserting that there are no deflationary risks for the latter half of the year. People are afraid that China might experience a long time of slow economic growth, similar to what happened in Japan's lost decades. In Japan, prices and wages didn't increase for a long time, and this situation could affect the whole world. Even though the government tried to make the economy better, it hasn't worked very well yet. The global market's mistrust in China's policies and the CCP's erratic behavior has culminated in a declining willingness to invest. Once a hub for foreign enterprises, China now finds itself shunned as foreign investors withdraw and seek more stable ground elsewhere. But let's zoom out for a second. China isn't just an economic powerhouse for itself. It's a major player on the global stage. From energy to raw materials to food, China's the go-to market. So, when China's economy starts to hiccup, the rest of the world feels it. Think of it as a chain reaction. China imports less, other countries take a hit, and a ripple effect sweeps across the global economy. You might wonder, how did China get here? This wasn't an overnight tumble. Earlier this year, China set a goal to keep inflation at 3%, but alas, that's not what happened. Inflation plummeted into a negative territory. To counter this, the government tried everything from stimulus packages to slashing interest rates, but the cracks in the dam were already too deep. And here's where things take a twist. Chinese officials seem to have gone silent. Meetings declined, communications curtailed, and opinions suppressed. Why? Well, a new anti-espionage law looms over them. This law was launched this June, which places a veil of secrecy over every move. It's like the officials have been sent back to school with mandatory mandatory training on how to keep a secret. But what are the consequences of this newfound silence? For starters, foreign direct investment has hit a 25-year low. The uncertainty has made investors wary, and China's once trusted growth story seems to be losing its sheen. This isn't just about economic numbers, it's about trust, the trust that China has earned on the global stage. Now let's take an in-depth look at a few factors that are compounding this economic deceleration. First on our list is the turbulence within the real estate market. China recognized the emergence of a property bubble several years ago and swiftly commenced efforts to deflate it. However, the speed of this intervention has outpaced the economy's ability to recalibrate, culminating in a sharp plunge in home prices in the year 2023. China is a country where real estate contributes to a whopping 30% to its GDP, and nearly 70% of people's wealth is tied up in property. It's a nation where home buyers, in a unique twist, often pay upfront for projects that are still under construction. China's real estate landscape has been going downhill for a while. It all started with the collapse of Evergrande Group, the second largest real estate developer, drowning in a staggering $300 billion debt. As the dust settles, the latest grim news comes from Country Garden, once the leader in sales. It's now teetering on the edge, missing payments on massive dollar-denominated bonds. This has triggered alarm bells about the widespread debt crisis plaguing developers. For decades, the Chinese saw real estate as the ultimate safe investment, much like the middle class anywhere else. In the 90s, a property frenzy swept the nation, prices skyrocketed, and developers expanded left and right. But here's where things took a turn no one saw coming: debt. By 2020, the Chinese government decided it was time to hit the brakes on easy credit for property developers. It was a crackdown that aimed to put the brakes on the unbridled expansion. But as they say, what goes up must come down. The sudden halt led to a cash crunch, unfinished projects, and developers struggling to meet their debt obligations. Cut to last year, and a unique rebellion took root. Home buyers from over 300 housing projects across 100 cities protested by refusing to pay mortgages for their unfinished homes. The Chinese government stepping in with solutions. They're extending support for developers until the end of 2024, and cities like Zhengzhou are relaxing purchasing rules to stimulate demand. But all eyes are on one company, Country Garden. Will it survive the storm? The second factor is about China's banking crisis and local government being in too much debt. Traditionally, a financial crisis is marked by bank failures triggered by massive deposit withdrawals, leading to a domino effect that can shake an economy to its core. Yet China has managed to sidestep this scenario, leaving us to wonder what's keeping its banks afloat. If we take a closer look at the numbers, Western economists have repeatedly pointed out a seemingly unsustainable debt level in China's financial system, raising alarms for nearly 2 decades. But here's the catch. Despite these warnings, China's financial system hasn't crashed as anticipated. The question is, how is this possible? On one side, a lot of money from banks is going into companies that aren't doing well and government projects that don't make sense. This makes a lot of bad debt. On the other side, some rich and powerful people are taking money from banks for themselves. The government focuses on keeping things stable, even if they're not fixing the real problems. Speaking of stability, the CCP's methods for averting runs on deposits are nothing short of drastic. Mobilizing police, military, and even resorting to force have been witnessed, as demonstrated in the shocking events of May 14, 2023, when over 1,300 police officers were deployed in Zhengzhou City, Henan Province, to maintain order amidst discontented depositors. But can someone who put their money in the bank just sue the bank if something goes wrong? In theory, yes, but in reality, it's like a small person fighting against a big giant. Banks have support from the government, which makes it really hard for normal people to win. Many people have lost their savings, showing that fairness is hard to find. As of 2021, China has a huge number of banks, 4,602 to be exact. Many of these are small banks that are at high risk of failing. China's financial system has a lot of hidden bad debt, something called shadow banking, and relies heavily on the real estate market. This is like a time bomb that could affect the whole world. On July 11th, it was said that the value of China's banking companies dropped a lot, the biggest drop ever. A special index that shows how well Chinese banks are doing fell by a big 14% from its highest point this year, taking away a massive $77 billion from their total value. Big financial company Goldman Sachs made things worse by saying that major Chinese banks weren't doing well. This caused uncertainty around the world. Goldman Sachs made a big report about 12 Chinese banks that are on the stock market. 5 were labeled as sell, including powerhouses like the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC, Agricultural Bank of China, Bank of Communications, and China Minsheng Banking Corp. Meanwhile, 3 were rated as neutral, including the Bank of China, China Merchants Bank, and Nanjing Bank. The rest, China Construction Bank, Postal Savings Bank, Ningbo Bank, and Ping An Bank, earned a buy rating. The report underscored China's rising local government debt and credit portfolio losses. These growing concerns pose a substantial risk to bank profitability and could cripple earnings growth and dividend payments. Goldman Sachs also estimated that China's local government debt has surged a staggering 11.14 times between 2008 and 2022. As local governments grapple with these mounting debts, they've resorted resorted to several desperate measures, such as refusing to repay debts. Many local governments have defaulted on payments for vital infrastructure projects, causing chaos and uncertainty amongst contractors and local businesses, implementing tax increases, pay cuts, and even layoffs, reducing expenditures on social welfare programs and diverting funds. Lastly, leveraging hefty fines to generate revenue. The Chinese Communist Party seems to be looking towards state-owned banks to bail out local government debt. This strategy might provide temporary relief, but comes at the cost of jeopardizing banks' profitability and economic stability. The third factor is unemployment. China's rapid pivot towards high-tech domains and advanced manufacturing has birthed the need for specialized skills. However, this transition has outpaced the evolution of the education system, causing a conspicuous gap between the skill sets possessed by the youth and those demanded by the dynamic job market. The repercussion? China's youth find themselves shouldering the weight of the economic resurgence, with youth unemployment statistics defying the overall jobless rate by a factor of 4. A convergence of escalating living costs, salary misalignments, and regulatory constraints has added fuel to the fire. A distinctive trend emerges in response to the urban employment crisis, an unforeseen reverse migration. The once predictable flow of youth from rural to urban areas has reversed, as young graduates now breathe new life into rural regions, fostering entrepreneurship and innovation. Government-backed initiatives to enhance a rural infrastructure ensure urban comforts reach these vibrant pockets. This big change could make China's economy different, but experts urge caution. Even though rural areas are getting better, they might not be able to give jobs to all the young people looking for work. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, the youth employment rate in urban areas hit a staggering 20.4% in April, the highest since records began in 2018. This is a worrying sign, especially with nearly 12 million college graduates expected to enter the job market soon. These numbers are official, so it's safe to assume that the real unemployment rate is likely to be even higher. It's not just about a lack of opportunities. Even highly educated individuals are feeling the heat. Graduates from prestigious schools and seasoned professionals are struggling to secure suitable jobs. Discrimination based on age and experience levels further exacerbates the issue. There's this idea of a four-nosed life: no dating, no marriage, no buying homes, and no having children. It shows how frustrated and helpless many young Chinese people feel about their future in an uncertain economy. People are not following the usual life steps because they don't feel like they can in this situation. Places that were busy with stores and businesses are now empty. From Shenzhen to Shanghai, businesses are having a hard time because the economy is not doing well. The ripple effect is undeniable. However, China's future isn't only decided by choices made within its borders. The way countries interact with each other also has a big influence. The ongoing tensions between China and the US create an unclear future for the economy. This affects things like trade and the ability to use advanced technologies. In response, many Western vassal states are pivoting away from China in terms of supply chains, potentially disrupting China's role as a manufacturing hub. China's economic deflation isn't just about prices falling. It's a symphony of interconnected factors with repercussions echoing worldwide. As China's economy navigates these challenging waters, the rest of the world watches closely, because in our interconnected world, no economy stands alone. Thank you for watching. Until we meet again. After watching our videos, or other YouTubers' videos, we're sure some of you guys have thought about starting your own channel. One of the biggest hurdles people face when starting a YouTube channel is that they are not comfortable showing their face on videos. Not everyone wants to give up their privacy and be in the public eye all the time. That's one of the big reasons why our videos are made in documentary style. That's also why we launched a free 5-day email course on how you get started and grow your own channel without having to put yourself out in public. If you're interested, you can sign up now by clicking the link below or scanning the QR code on screen.
Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia on December 9th. The rumored goal of the visit was to convince the Saudi crown prince to ditch the USA as an ally and join China's plan to dismantle the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. You see, this visit, and many others, are all part of the CCP's plan to become the world's strongest superpower, and the only way the CCP achieves that goal is by dethroning the dollar from its status as the world's strongest currency. So in today's video, let's go over why the CCP hates the dollar's power and how it plans to strip it away.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Saudi Arabia. Since President Xi arrived, the Saudi energy minister has been speaking. What has he been saying?
You have to remember, this is a way of Saudi Arabia seeking new alliances with other countries outside of the United States.
Chinese President Xi Jinping wants oil-producing nations to stop using the US dollar in their sales to China. It's part of a campaign to de-dollarize the world economy.
For us to truly understand why the dollar is so powerful, we have to back up a little bit and look at how the dollar became the world's reserve currency. Back before World War I, the British pound was the world's reserve currency, as they were the strongest economy, and they had the most gold. Currencies were basically all backed up by gold at this time. But World Wars I and II destroyed the UK's economy, and most European countries' economies, all while the US economy had massive growth during this period, and was able to accumulate massive amounts of gold, as you can see from this chart. At one point after World War II, the US had more than 3/4 of the world's gold reserves. This gave massive leverage to the USA government. So, the government used this leverage to gather all the major countries at the Bretton Woods Conference, and got a lot of them to agree to peg their currency to the US dollar, and the US dollar was then pegged to gold. Now, a lot of people point to this event in history and claim that the US dollar got its place as a world reserve currency by taking advantage of other countries that were struggling economically after the two world wars. Which, I mean, this is just not true at all. All right, let me explain. These countries didn't sign the Bretton Woods Agreement because they were forced to. No. They signed this agreement because it was in their best interest to do so. The US was the strongest economy, which meant that it was the most stable one. So countries felt extremely comfortable pegging their currency to the US dollar. Once countries pegged their currency to dollars, the stability that came with it made it easier for businesses to trade across borders, which in turn helped these countries rebuild faster after the war. On top of that, the Bretton Woods Agreement also created the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank. The IMF's job is to monitor the exchange rates of all currencies and help countries maintain their peg to the US dollar. The World Bank, on the other hand, actually loaned money to countries to help them with post-war recovery efforts. As you can see now, the US played a big part in helping countries recover from the world wars, and that's why these countries accepted the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, this agreement was great to help countries recover from the war, and part of the Bretton Woods infrastructure still remains today. But as the United States started spending more and more on domestic programs and foreign wars, everyone realized that this peg to gold was unsustainable for the long term. That's why in 1971, US President Richard Nixon put a temporary pause on dollar redemption for gold. And that pause was never lifted, thus taking the dollar off the gold standard.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
Now, the United States was still the strongest economy, but for the US dollar to still be the world's reserve currency, there needs to be a lot of demand for their currency, so that market price is always at a fair value. Otherwise, any big transaction would move the price too much and make things even more complicated for international trade. So instead of creating demand through gold, the US government decided to create demand through oil, which one can argue may be more valuable than gold in the modern economy. Another thing that's really valuable to me is you guys hitting the like button. Every like signals to YouTube that this is a good video and it should be recommended to more people. So please, hit that like button.
The traces of black gold in the Valley of Oil lured English oil investors to the remote and barren karst mountain range. String heat, lack of water, and the hostility of the local nomads couldn't discourage the oil pioneers.
During World War II, demand for oil skyrockets, and the resource becomes a major international issue. At the end of the war, the United States signs an alliance with Saudi Arabia, guaranteeing security of the country in return for privileged access to its oil.
Indeed, oil has been and continues to be the world's most sought-after commodity, which seems to have a limitless number of uses.
World War II proved to every nation how important oil is going to be in the future. The Saudis found that they were sitting atop the world's biggest oil field. Talk about hitting the jackpot. After World War II, things got a little messy in the Middle East. Here's a list of the wars that happened in the Middle East between 1945 and 1970. You kind of have to scroll to see the complete list. It's a lot. So because of this, the Saudi monarchy felt a little uneasy and decided to strike a deal with the strongest military in the world, the United States. In 1974, the Saudis agreed to sell oil only in US dollars, and in return, the US promised to supply them with weapons and guarantee their safety. Following the Saudis' decision, all the OPEC nations decided to trade oil in dollars as well. As I have covered in previous videos, OPEC is one of the world's biggest oil producers, and as demand for oil grew in the coming decades, the demand for the dollar grew with it. Here you can see the massive growth in the world's oil consumption. Most of this oil was being bought in dollars. That means these countries need to buy dollars and keep them in their reserves to make sure they can always buy oil for their citizens. Here you can see that the dollar is, by far, the biggest foreign reserve held by countries around the world. This comes with its own benefits for the United States that I'll cover in just a minute, but first, let's go to the second part of that Saudi-US deal that had a huge effect on our economy. When the Saudis agreed to sell oil in US dollars, they also agreed to something else. Something I don't see other people focus on that much, but I think it's just as important. The Saudi crown agreed to hold its excess profits from the oil sales in US treasuries. And slowly, it wasn't just Saudi Arabia, but most countries were holding their excess reserves in US treasuries. This meant that the Saudi-US deal didn't just increase the demand for dollars, but also increased the demand for US debt securities. So the US government is easily able to raise debt whenever needed because of this high demand. This debt has been a huge reason behind the massive economic growth over the past few decades. Now, as you can already tell, having the dollar as the world's reserve currency has helped us tremendously. But the benefits don't just stop at a domestic level. It also gives the US a huge leverage internationally.
White House deliver, as promised, swift and severe economic sanctions last week, targeting Russian banks, targeting oligarchs, trying to move to limit their access to that SWIFT system.
It's all happening under the Global Magnitsky Act, which gives the president full authority to sanction human rights offenders.
The U.S. has taken a myriad of steps to restrict the supplies of advanced computer chips to China, not just from the U.S., but from allied nations as well.
Since there's so much demand for the dollar is the most stable currency. This has helped more and more countries adopt it for trade as well. But if any country ever gets too unfriendly with the USA, like, say, Iran, North Korea, or Russia, the US is just able to impose sanctions on them and basically cut them off from the global financial system. Also, since a lot of countries hold most of their reserves within US treasuries, the US is able to freeze their reserves like they did in the case of Russia after it invaded Ukraine. The power of the US dollar is very far-reaching, and any bank in any corner of the world has to follow US rules if they want to stay in the financial sector. Now, I'm not going to cover every way that the government can use the dollar's power, but hopefully you guys get the point. The dollar as a reserve currency is extremely beneficial for us domestically, and gives the government massive leverage internationally. Now, this is the kind of power China would like to wield for their own country. That way they can grow their power and influence even quicker. Luckily for China, there are many other countries who aren't too comfortable with the dollar having that kind of power over them. So, China has been trying to push trade in its own currency, the yuan, to gain more of a leverage on the world stage. After Western sanctions on Russia, China and Russia trade has mostly been in yuan. China is also using its loans to developing countries as a way to push them to use the yuan for trade. I have covered extensively how the CCP uses sharkish loans to developing nations as a way to gain power over them. You can check that out by watching this video. Now, China is using the same leverage to increase the use of the yuan. China is requiring countries to pay back loans in yuan. This can be effective, if successful, because there are currently over 140 countries in China's Belt and Road Initiative. And if they all agree to use the yuan more, it can definitely give the currency more stability. China is also the world's biggest exporter, meaning that countries are buying stuff from China. Here's a map of all the countries that currently import most of their goods from China. If the CCP is able to convince even a fraction of these countries to switch to the yuan for trade, it can have big implications for the dollar's status.
Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Saudi Arabia on Wednesday. And what was on the agenda? To break the long-time U.S. dominance in the region.
China will also make full use of the Shanghai Petroleum and National Gas Exchange as a platform to carry out yuan settlement of oil and gas trade.
The visit is Xi's first to the kingdom in 6 years. The two countries affirmed their ties and signed a series of strategic deals.
And that is what Xi Jinping wants to achieve from his trip to Saudi Arabia. If you've seen my previous video on Saudi Arabia, then you know that US-Saudi relations have been a little rocky recently. I highly recommend you check it out, but here's a quick recap. President Biden visited the Crown Prince to get assurance that OPEC won't cut oil production and push up the price of oil. It seemed that that trip worked. But then, out of nowhere, OPEC announced a major cut in oil production right before the midterms. That's because the Saudis are not too happy with the US pulling out of Afghanistan and getting too friendly with Iran, plus many more issues. After the oil production cuts, Biden claimed that there will be consequences for Saudi Arabia for cutting oil production during a sensitive time in the world economy. The talks about passing the NOPEC bill also picked up, where the US would be able to sue leaders of oil-producing nations in the OPEC cartel. Of course, the Saudis were not too happy with all of this, so they floated the idea of maybe selling their oil in a currency that's not the dollar. And this is where Xi Jinping comes in. Saudis have previously shown interest in accepting the yuan instead of the dollar. And if Xi Jinping can convince them, then it could be a huge deal in China's effort to dismantle the dollar's power. Now, I'm writing this script at 2 a.m. the day before the trip has happened. But by the time I finish editing this video, I'm sure the trip will be done. Currently, I don't know what's going to come out of this trip, but I'm sure you guys are wondering, if Xi Jinping is successful, does that mean China will have the world's new reserve currency? Well, no. Let me explain. There are a lot of countries who are not comfortable with the US having so much power over them, and rightfully so. But this is not because they hate the US in particular, no. They just don't want any other country having power over them. I mean, think about it, it's human nature to feel uneasy when someone else has so much control over your future. That's the case here. So let's say, hypothetically, every country does switch to using the yuan. Doing that doesn't really solve anything. Instead of the US having all this power, now China would have it. And for most countries, they would rather deal with the US having that power than China. The CCP has a long history of manipulating their currency, punishing countries for questioning their actions, and overall being opaque with their plans for the future. So the chances of replacing the dollar as a reserve currency are low. And even if that happens, it's most likely going to be a big bucket of currencies that replace the dollar, not the yuan. The United States is the undisputed world's greatest superpower. By every metric, be it financial, economic, or military, the US seems to stand head and shoulders above the rest of the world. However, with the turn of this new decade, could the balance of power be shifting?
The Chinese economy now.
It's far exceeded expectations and forecasts and is the highest reading since April 2012.
We've gotten so used to China being the leader. And
China's relentless rise, not a problem as the economy doubled in value 4 times between 1980 and 2010.
That is a very, very impressive figure. China seems to leave everyone else behind.
After several decades of being the top dog, the major question in international relations is now, is the United States' run as the world's greatest superpower coming to an end? Ray Dalio made an in-depth video on this topic titled The Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. In it, he talked about how the world order is changing and that China is coming out on top. He's not alone in this thinking either. Many analysts agree seeing a rising China ready to catch up or even surpass the United States in the near future. Several metrics have been presented to show how this will be possible and how Beijing will continue to grow at the unprecedented rate it grew in the last few decades. In fact, for many, the question is not whether China will become the strongest global superpower, but just how soon. However, from my perspective, this is not only impossible, but the idea that Beijing will surpass Washington is based on a closed circuit of thought. In this video, I'll explore just why China will never surpass the US, the reasons for it, and my backing for this. This is a game of global superiority, and though the US in recent years seems to be in somewhat of a decline, it is still head and shoulders above China. Let me tell you why. And as we dive into the deep issue of economic, military, and soft power dominance, please feel free to like this video to counter the CCP bots that often do not approve of anything anti-China. I really appreciate your support. All right, now let's get back into it. China is largely viewed as the only country with the raw potential to become a true global peer to the United States. This mostly comes as a result of its economic growth, which is projected to grow to surpass the USA. To China's credit, the immense level of growth the nation has experienced in the last half-century is nothing short of miraculous. China has grown from being a struggling nation to being up there with the rest of the world. Among the major talking points, China's GDP is always used as the primary point. And true to form, China's GDP and GDP growth is a thing of beauty. The GDP annual growth rate in China averaged 9% from 1989 to 2022. It does not take a genius to realize just how insane this level of growth is. I mean, it's almost impossible for modern economies. This is primarily why China is viewed as a miracle country. By the same metric, the GDP annual growth rate in the United States averaged 3.13% from 1948 until 2022. When you compare these values and the forecasts that are given, it's easy to see why Chinese dominance has become a large talking point. When you bring in the actual gross domestic product value for the nations, they paint a different yet similar story. China's GDP is worth just under $18 trillion according to official data from the World Bank. Just so you know how humongous this GDP value is, it represents 7.94% of the entire world economy. That's a lot. Despite this, China still falls shy of the $25.46 trillion US GDP value. Even with this massive difference, many believe that when you factor in the GDP growth rate and the relative GDP difference between the two, China's on pace to surpass the USA. Well, I think not. And let me explain why. You see, GDP is not the end-all be-all factor. In fact, it's largely misleading when it's used in this context by those who are adamant that China's economy will surpass that of the USA. To start off with, the GDP measurement was originally designed to measure mid-20th century manufacturing economies. This was a time when manufacturing and industrial booms largely determined how developed a nation was, and how much growth the nation was experiencing. Now, however, GDP estimates can be misleading, because the more knowledge-based and globalized a country's production is, the more its GDP underestimates its economy's true size. To counter this, and to come up to modern times, the UN developed a new statistic, and using it, you can see just how China's power is inflated when we talk about GDP. This new method is called inclusive wealth. In a nutshell, inclusive wealth represents economists' most systematic effort to date to calculate a state's wealth in a way that is better than GDP. It basically solves the biggest problem that comes with only using GDP. You see, the problem with GDP is that it measures a flow, whereas inclusive wealth measures a stock. To put it plainly, as one person said, gauging an economy by its GDP is like judging a company by its quarterly profits, without ever peeking at its balance sheet. In this context, China's quarterly profits are high, but the balance sheet, well, it's not as deep as their Washington counterparts. Because inclusive wealth measures the pool of resources a government can conceivably draw on to achieve its strategic objectives, it's the more useful metric when thinking about geopolitical competition. So you get it now? When calculating inclusive wealth, you consider several things. Firstly, you take manufactured capital. That includes roads, buildings, machines, and equipment. Secondly, you take human capital, which is the level of skill, education, and health of the population. Lastly, you consider the natural capital of a nation. When you work with these three factors, you can get a more accurate picture of the value of a nation's economy and its strength. When you calculate the United States' inclusive wealth, it comes to almost $144 trillion. China's, in comparison, is $32 trillion. This is less than a quarter of that of the USA. We don't have to religiously stick to semantics and the minuscule figures, but this figure alone tells you that China is far behind the USA. As much as it may be developing faster, what the US has in the bank is significantly more already. It's a lot like getting a job right out of college that pays slightly more than your dad's job. Yeah, you might earn more now, but he still has more wealth overall. The time factor cannot be understated. So, now that we've debunked the GDP frame of reference that's used to overestimate China, let's move on to some of the major reasons why China simply will never surpass the US economy. At least, not anytime soon. One of the things that cannot be understated when rating nations is the technological prowess that a nation holds. This is a major advantage that can allow them to be on the cusp of cutting-edge ideas, technologies, and weapons. One can say that it is this strength in technological achievement that allowed the US to put an end to the Second World War by developing technology that the enemy at that point didn't have. When comparing the US and China, well, it's a no-brainer. China is significantly outclassed. One cannot begin to understate the technological disparity between these two nations. That is why when the US does something like this, China suffers pretty badly, as it is right now.
Washington has imposed sweeping controls on exports of semiconductors, also known as microchips, to Beijing.
And that's had a dramatic effect. Every American engineering executive involved in the chip industry in China has resigned, effectively immediately.
I think this is another sign of the Biden administration ratcheting up the pressure on China.
There are now fears this competition for technology may intensify an already fragile relationship.
I made a video about this topic a while back. Take a look at it for more in-depth information. In a nutshell, the Biden administration has banned the selling of US-made microchips or any microchips using US intellectual property to China. Given that a vast majority of microchips in China involve either US IP or US processes, China is in a bind. By lagging behind in this sector, it's being punished by Biden. In fact, many people don't know that China is vastly inferior to the US when it comes to technology. The picture that many see is of China exporting millions of high-tech goods, and they seem to credit China for all of that. And this is wrong. You see, in a world of globalized production, half of all Chinese exports consist of what economists called processing trade, meaning that parts are imported into China for assembly and then exported afterwards. So China is great at assembling things and being a manufacturing hub, but the technology and the intellectual property, well, they always come from elsewhere. If you want to get a better gauge of this, take a look at this World Bank data on payments for the use of intellectual property. With over $128 billion in payments received, the United States is far and away the leading source of innovative technologies. China, on the other hand, received a respectable but measly $11 billion in payment. Let me break this down. These are amounts that are paid to each country as a fee or commission for the use of each country's intellectual property. It's basically people saying thank you for showing us the light. And in that regard, many more people are thanking the US. I mean, you gotta thank the best, right? Another good indicator of the technological gap is the number of so-called triadic patents registered in the United States, Europe, and Japan. In 2012, nearly 14,000 of these patents originated in the United States, compared to just under 2,000 in China. The technological and knowledge superiority trickles down to everything, actually. The distribution of highly influential articles in science and engineering, well, they tell the same story, with the United States accounting for almost half of these articles, more than 8 times of China's share. So does the breakdown of Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, and physiology or medicine. Since 1990, 114 have gone to US-based researchers. China-based researchers have received 2. What this shows, in a nutshell, is that the US is far more advanced in the technological sector. This allows them to create cutting-edge tech that is more progressive and more efficient. This tech prowess largely extends to military prowess as well. In this regard, the US is leaps and bounds ahead of China, and technology has a huge role to play in this. For example, the United States spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. A good portion of this budget goes towards research and development purposes. Back in 2012, the United States spent over $79 billion on military research and development. This figure is more than 13 times what China spent in the same period. This funding of tech that can be used to boost the power of a nation cannot be underestimated. We are not just talking about 2012 either. China is decades behind the US in terms of creating structures that allow for the procuring and manufacture of advanced weapon systems. As time goes on, these systems become more complex, and the gap between the nations widens. Let's just use jets as an example to highlight this. Back in the 60s, it took just 5 years to develop a jet aircraft. By the 90s, that number had become 10 years due to the sheer complexity of these jets. Today, it takes 15 years to design and build the most advanced fighter aircraft, and military satellites can take even longer. Yeah, you heard that right, 15 years. So even if another country managed to build the scientific and industrial base to develop the many types of weapons that gives the United States command of the commons, there would be a long lag before it could actually possess them. That is the position that China now finds itself in. The Pentagon simply has resources and infrastructure in place that the Chinese do not possess. And even if they do, we all know the US is obsessed with their military. The Pentagon is not going to be sitting idle while China advances. China's lagging technological power is one of the reasons why they can't surpass the US, either economically or as a de facto global leader. So it's no wonder that China has resorted to things like this, allegedly.
Back in China, the debt bubble is about to burst. As we speak, a crisis is spiraling.
Chinese mortgage holders have been withholding repayments en masse.
Infrastructure debt is piling up, and China is increasingly juggling to keep up appearances.
China is looking at a state-owned enterprise with $850 billion in debt that it can't repay.
Its debt tripled to a staggering $43 trillion. That's almost 3 times the size of its economy.
This point is one I found especially fun when I was researching this topic. Do you know the long-running joke about the US debt problem on the internet? Well, it turns out that China is in hotter waters. After keeping things under wraps, as Beijing is known to do, the debt issue has escalated to a point where it needs addressing. For starters, Beijing has begun to take steps to sort out its troubled property sector. It has announced a new financial stability law that, according to the vice chair of the People's Bank of China, aims to control risk. Such measures may offer temporary relief, but they can't address China's deeper economic troubles and their reflection in financial markets. Put simply, debt is a serious problem in the country. All this was exposed through the real estate market fiascos. This is because the real estate market made up 30% of China's GDP, and it is what mainly powered the Chinese economy. But the debt explosion, triggered by the bankruptcy of the China Evergrande Group, was catastrophic. The damage that it caused trickled down to the local governments, who up until then had made up for budgetary deficits by selling land to real estate developers. With that no longer an option, a vacuum was left in the system, resulting in the deterioration of local government finances. This has served to highlight the disparity of wealth between the wealthy coastal region and the poor western region, leading to social unrest. Don't think I'm exaggerating this either, no. Counting it wholly, that is debt inclusive of public, private, and in all sectors of the economy, the figure amounted to the equivalent of $51.9 trillion. And in case you didn't know, that's a lot. Just to put that into perspective, that is thrice the size of the GDP that we were talking about earlier. That is extreme. In fact, this is the highest level recorded in the 27 years since Beijing first began to track such statistics. This Chinese debt now far exceeds the burdens facing the United States. In fact, relative to GDP, it's 40% higher than America's. Yikes, that's bad. And when you add in the economic statistics that say that more developed countries, such as the United States, because of their greater relative wealth, tend to have higher relative debt burdens, This is because they can support them more easily than less developed economies, like China. So the US, as bad as it is for Washington, is still in a far better position than Beijing. Remember what I said about the disparity of wealth between the rich and the poor? Well, China, just as you would expect from the CCP, is attempting to solve the issue of inequality through force. Xi's push for common prosperity will ultimately undermine the nation's growth potential, as it will surely hurt the validity of Chinese corporations. Private enterprises in China are rapidly becoming public under state control. The tale of Jack Ma, Alibaba, and the A&T Group is a clear example of this. The CCP's style of operations is fixated on some form of Chinese-style capitalism. This might have worked earlier, but as a nation grows and companies expand, all I see coming from this is a negative impact on the economy. All I see is inequality worsening in China, resulting in more of this.
A massive protest over frozen bank deposits turned violent in
China, where economic woes have pushed people to the streets. People across China are not happy, and their anger exploded on the streets for several days.
Go on strike, remove the dictator and national traitor Xi Jinping.
Protests at the main Foxconn factory in China, people wielding sticks, smashing surveillance cameras, and
demanding an end to COVID lockdowns and daring to openly call for the resignation of Chinese leader Xi Jinping.
China has more trouble brewing at home, and this will only serve to cripple it. Aware of this, the CCP has designated zero COVID, economic growth of 5%, and debt reduction as its three main policy objectives. Already all of this is in disarray as there are protests against zero COVID, the nation has failed to meet the 5% target by almost half, and that debt is ballooning. It's honestly a mess. Rectifying all this is going to take time. So, talk about China surpassing the US economically or otherwise will have to take a back seat while Xi tries to blow out the raging fire in his backyard. But there is more. Have you ever heard of soft power? Well, it's something that the US has tons of and China severely lacks. Soft power can be defined as the capacity to influence other nations through the use of persuasion and attraction, rather than coercion or force. Soft power relies on culture, arts, and science. Think of it as the finishing touch on a country's dominance or standing. You simply can't assume control of the world in this modern era unless you can dominate through cultural products. This is something that the US has mastered. Anywhere you go in the world, you see the marks of US culture in everything, from products to films and television series. But when it comes to China, the story is different. Despite having deep and long-time roots in history and time-honored traditions, China's culture is not largely adopted or paraded. I can even out an example of TikTok in this regard. Owing to a lack of Chinese content, it hasn't served as a window for distributing Chinese culture to the extent that it was intended. In fact, the app has been dominated mainly by American culture. There is something that can be said about that too, but I'm going to save that for another video. A lack of soft power impacts economic growth negatively, but mainly, it does not give room to allow a country to be the global leader the way the US is. It is safe to say that China's soft power is in its infancy. In China's own continent of Asia, despite it being the most economically powerful nation in the region, other countries exude more soft power. Nations like South Korea and Japan quickly come to mind in this regard. Why does China not exude soft power? Well, much like North Korea, the answer is the same for both countries. The nation simply clamps down too much on creativity. It stifles creativity through the erection of a military state. The CCP endeavors to regulate speech unrelated to patriotism or everyday life. In fact, by censoring everything online, the CCP can dictate what they allow to flourish and what they don't. This picking and choosing by the top brass affects the nation in unimaginable ways. Put simply, if the channels of communication in China continue to be choked and censored, creativity will die out. Though Asian culture is now widely consumed in the West, Chinese culture's share of the market is minimal at best. What this shows is China's inability to globalize itself. The CCP takes a look inward policy And this insistence on doing everything the Chinese way itself is causing the country's soft power to languish. What this has resulted in is the eroding of the competitiveness of China and their companies. I'm pretty sure that after the Alibaba and A&T saga, where the CCP let political motives suppress global financial records, all this holds a lot more weight than ever before. Now look, this is not the first time in history someone has predicted the fall of America at the hands of a rising superpower. At some point in history, Japan was pegged to be the nation that would outpace the US in terms of its economy. Since we're all here in the present reality, you can see that that was just a dream that never really happened. In my opinion, talk of China surpassing the US economy and overtaking the US as a global leader is exactly that. It's just talk. None of the metrics, when examined closely, seem to favor China's ascension over the US. Of all the reasons we've talked about today, we have yet to even touch on other key factors such as demographics. China's population is already aging, and the country has yet to accumulate very much wealth. Astronomical expenses will be needed to make sure its aging population doesn't tip China into social unrest. The cost may be too much for China to handle. In fact, it will definitely be too much to handle if it's carried alongside the other factors. My point is that I can make another video that's just as long, with solid reasons as to why China is not in a position to surpass the US just yet. Between the CCP's intrusiveness, horrible foreign policy, social instability, and a loss of a competitive edge on global markets, China is in a bind. When you put all these together, it's hard to imagine a future that puts China above the US. For now, our discussion should be whether China will survive its current dilemmas, and if it does, how will it be by the end of it all? Only after these in-house issues are resolved can we revisit this China over the US question. For now, it seems that America's dominance will live to see another decade as the undisputed strongest global superpower. If you enjoy my videos, it might surprise you to hear, but you're probably not getting to watch all of them. That's because every so often one of my videos gets restricted and demonetized by YouTube. Like this one about the CCP's occupation of Tibet, or the one about the CCP's treatment of Uyghurs, or the one about protests in China against the CCP. When a video gets restricted, it means that YouTube will stop recommending it to you, even if you're subscribed to my channel. So this is why I started my own newsletter, Global Recaps, so YouTube can't decide which topics you can learn about and which you can't. Every week I send an email directly to your inbox that covers all the major geopolitical news from around the world, and there's no third party that can censor any topics in there. You can sign up now using the link in the description, and it's completely free. The United States has basically declared war on China, and this is bound to have devastating effects worldwide. This war is not being fought on the military front, however, at least not yet. It's being fought on the economic front. And boy, has the US just dropped quite the nuclear bomb on Beijing.
New export controls in the US from the Biden administration have cut off China's access to advanced microchips, affecting Beijing's military advancements. There are now fears this competition for technology may intensify an already fragile relationship.
What we see now is the United States, the Biden administration, taking as many steps as possible to try to limit China's access to these emerging technologies.
And John, this is really coming at a time when we have the Party Congress in China also underway.
Chip stocks across Asia are falling victim to the escalating US-China tech war. The sell-off slashed more than $240 billion from the sector's global market value. Investors, they are spooked by the fresh curbs placed on China to block its access to American technology.
You see, the United States, under the Biden administration, has sanctioned all US microchip technology from being made available in China. This was done to contain Beijing's technology and military ambitions, especially as the CCP's foreign policy has turned aggressive in recent years. The impact, repercussions, and consequences of such an action cannot be understated. Seeing as China is the world's top manufacturer of, well, basically everything, cutting them off from microchip technology is tantamount to cutting off their lifeblood, and they will not take it lying down. Even the Prime Minister of Singapore has said that these actions will have severe ramifications. So,
let's get into the finer details of what is happening and the reason it is happening.
And now the US has turned to another theater of conflict, the South China Sea. America has sent an aircraft carrier to the region. China responded with a military exercise.
Comes amid heightened tensions between the US and China over technology, Taiwan, and China's tacit support of Russia's war in Ukraine.
Worsening US-China relations could drive a wedge between tech players.
Growing divide, differences in ideology, and even systems of governance are playing out over a range of issues. These include trade disputes, the South China Sea, and more recently, escalating tensions over Taiwan.
New export controls in the US from the Biden administration have cut off China's access to advanced microchips, affecting Beijing's military advancements.
To understand the severity of the US-imposed sanctions, you need to appreciate the importance of microchips in today's society. Everything from your phone, your washing machine, your TV, your car, your airplane, and your satellites need microchips to function. Microchips in their different capacities regulate various processes that allow your devices to run efficiently and smoothly. The better the quality of the microprocessor, the more efficient the process is. I can just hear the computer science crowd frantically commenting now about how wrong that is. I know, it's just a simplification for the purpose of storytelling. Calm down. Now, China, despite being the manufacturing hub of the world, has lagged in microchip technology. This is both in the form of intellectual property and the structures needed to create world-leading microchips. To curb this, they've simply been importing their microchips and using those in the products they make. At present, China consumes more than 3/4 of the microchips sold globally, but produces only about 15% of the global output. This shows the reliance that China has on imported microchips. So what it comes down to is that microchips are essential for China to continue being the manufacturing hub of the world. This is exactly the lifeblood vein that the United States is attacking. Before I talk about how the US has cut China off, how about you take a second to subscribe to the channel? Don't get cut off from the uncensored real news of what's happening around the world. Getting cut off isn't nice. Just ask China. Right, where was I? Oh yes, you see, in October of this year, the Biden administration published a sweeping set of export controls, including a measure to cut China off from certain semiconductor chips made anywhere in the world with US tools. Basically, if it's a microchip that's made in the US or with US resources, it is now banned from China. The US says it's done this in a bid to slow Beijing's technological and military advances. However, it's clear to see that more than just the Chinese military will suffer because of this. And if you are thinking that this is just a bluff, well, you're wrong. Biden is pretty serious about this as he has intensified matters. You see, the new regulations also add controls on some semiconductor production items. The US wants to increase its export controls to include semiconductor products, software technology, and other things used to develop and make integrated circuits. What it's doing is not just blocking the physical material chips. No, it's far more brutal than that. It's doing away with intellectual property as well. The specific know-how of manufacturing is being taken away from China. This is particularly clear because the government has said that US citizens and green card holders will also be banned from working on certain technologies for Chinese companies and entities. This is a heavy blow, because many experts in the microchip industry are Americans who are working in China. China had fluffed its microchip industry by bringing experts from the US and taking advantage of US relations to maximize on their R&D of microchips. But, well, I mean, that adventure seems to be over now. The fact that the Biden administration has effectively cut this off instantly will be a terrible blow to Chinese industries. Many have speculated that these measures were implemented in a bid to try and mess with President Xi Jinping's re-election. This is because they were perfectly timed to be announced just before the CCP Congress decided to reappoint President Xi. If that was the case, well, then it didn't work. But that's not to say that they haven't been effective, because they have and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. You see, the extensive rules, some of which go into effect immediately, build upon restrictions sent in letters earlier this year to top toolmakers KLA Corp, Lam Research Corp, and Applied Materials Incorporated, in effect requiring them to halt shipments of equipment to wholly Chinese-owned factories producing advanced logic chips. Bear in mind, these are world-class firms, the best of the best. Halting activity to China will certainly sting China a bit more than you'd think. It's important to note that this is not just a small policy change, by the way. That's why I mentioned in the introduction that this is tantamount to a declaration of economic war. This is because this set of sanctions could amount to the biggest shift in US policy towards shipping technology to China since the 1990s. Yes, you heard me, the 90s. Even Trump didn't hit him that hard in this particular space. If effective, which they no doubt will be, they could set China's chip manufacturing industry back years by forcing American and foreign companies that use US technology to cut off support for some of China's leading factories and chip designers. I say this because it will take years for China to be able to develop its own infrastructure and intellectual property to the point that it can create its own microchips that can rival those from Taiwan, the United States, Japan, and other global powers. Biden has unexpectedly rigged China. I bet the CCP now knows how all those people who got scammed by bad crypto projects feel now. And the US Department knows exactly what it has done. In a statement, it said that the export controls restrict China's ability to obtain advanced computing chips, develop and maintain supercomputers, and manufacture advanced semiconductors. Oh, that's cold. You guys know what else is cold? The YouTube algorithm. It's not being so kind with our videos about controversial and political topics like this one, so it would help me out a lot if you took a quick second to like this video. I put in a lot of effort into this video, and your likes help me out a lot in terms of the YouTube algorithm. Thanks all. I appreciate you.
What's China's reaction to this?
There's been some statements, usual comments about how this is just falling to the Cold War trap, but certainly there hasn't been much of an effort to impose punitive measures back on the United States.
China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology reportedly met with leading semiconductor companies over the past week, seeking to assess the fallout from the Biden administration's chip restrictions on China.
We have heard that China's top technology regulator, MIT, has gathered a number of the chip companies in China to assess the damage, the fallout from these Biden export curbs, and pledge what they can to support the companies in the future.
Let me be honest, guys. The chip ban is by no means a slap on the wrist. It is a roundhouse kick meant to knock your opponent to the floor in the hopes that they do not get back up. Even seasoned China analyst Bill Bishop says that the new regulations are a massive escalation in the rumbling trade and geopolitical tensions between the US and China. In his Sinocism newsletter, he said, "We are still trying to understand the impacts of the new controls. And frankly, I think many underestimate just how significant they are, both for technology supply chains and future developments, but more broadly for the US-China relationship." When an expert like that makes comments like those, you know there's substance to it. Another expert, Josep Borrell from the international research firm Global Data, said in a statement, "This is about artificial intelligence dominance, which underpins what many call the Fifth Industrial Revolution, and ultimately about global economic leadership for the next few decades." The reality of this war is that it has more at stake than just chips. It transcends the semiconductor industry, and it's about nothing less than the leadership of the world economy. And as the effects spread across to semiconductor manufacturers in Asia, such as the market-leading Taiwanese company TSMC, SK Hynix, and even Samsung are also threatened by them. S&P Global Ratings credit analyst Clifford Kurz said, "Many of the Asia-Pacific tech issuers that we rate have the financial strength to absorb the blow for at least the next 12 months. But longer term, the rating implications are clearly negative." I can hear some of you in the back of the classroom just screaming, "But China can make its own chips." Well, yes, but no. In reality, China's own equipment makers remain 4 to 5 years behind their overseas counterparts, making them well, unsuitable as instant substitutes for equipment lost from US suppliers such as KLA Corp, Applied Materials, and Lam Research. 4 to 5 years in the microchip industry is not just a gap, it's a crater, one that cannot be crossed easily. It will take years for China to compensate, especially after the immediate cutoff that they have just experienced. The Boston Consulting Group estimated in 2021 that a country would need at least $1 trillion in incremental upfront investments to build fully self-sufficient local supply chains. Did you hear that, China? $1 trillion+ in a few years? Doesn't sound so easy now, does it? However, what we need to understand is that though China will hurt big time in the short term, I think that they're gonna win in the long term. Why do I say that? Well, look at it this way. Now that they have been sanctioned and they don't really rely on US-made microchips, this is going to have a drastic effect on the Chinese market. On one hand, the new restrictions will no doubt spur Chinese chipmakers to progress and produce advanced chips by using creative engineering solutions. In the absence of US supplies, they have no choice but to do their own thing to ensure that they are not caught off guard again. Whether they like it or not, China will be forced to concentrate its manufacturing capacity on maturing technologies and leverage the service outside of China. The importance of technological self-sufficiency has been made a priority by Xi Jinping. It's so important that it was made a theme at this year's Congress, with Xi Jinping emphasizing the hostility of foreign rivals. As their own technology develops, it will rival that of the US over time, creating stiff competition in an area that largely had none, at least not from China. In the same breath, multiple US companies will lose a lot of revenue due to alienating the Chinese market. Nvidia, a technology company that focuses on graphics cards, has been one of the companies that have voiced out their concerns regarding the restrictions against China. Well, I mean, honestly, you can understand why they feel this way. I mean, they would lose literally over $400 million in sales per quarter by cutting off China. Even for them, that stings. Several companies are also feeling the hurt, and no doubt they will complain as we progress. What China will do is what we are yet to see. For now, the China Semiconductor Industry Association said in a statement that it hopes the US government would reverse its decision and return to international trade negotiation processes. However, direct statements from Beijing are yet to be received. Now that the Congress is over, Xi has been re-elected, and the focus is back on international matters. Things are bound to get interesting. Let's see how the CCP retaliates in what is already promising to be a devastating and dangerous war. Everyone knows how dangerous things will become with both the Singapore and Australian prime ministers saying that these actions will lead to a less stable world. Just how unstable will things get? Well, I suppose we'll find out soon enough, won't we?
This is China's Jiangling River, running dry because of record heat and drought that the country is facing. Just to show the true effect of this video, here's how the river looked before the drought. Recently, China's property woes, bank crisis, and foreign policy towards Taiwan have become hot topics on this channel and in the news media. It's easy to think this triad constitutes China's most significant problem. But no, there's another deadly crisis that threatens the Eastern nation as we know it. That is the water crisis. The current water crisis that China is facing might possibly be the biggest threat the country has on its hands. How bad is it, you ask? Well, it's this bad.
One of the worst droughts seen.
A record-breaking drought.
China's record heat wave and drought. Hydropower reservoirs are currently down by as much as half. Emergency measures to save electricity have come into effect.
With insufficient irrigation, crops here are dying. More than 350,000 people in rural Chongqing are suffering because of a shortage of water supplies.
Let's dive more into detail on China's dry spell and the CCP's role in worsening the situation. The truth that the CCP has hidden for many years but is now coming to light as an unavoidable catastrophe is that China is on the brink of collapse due to a water crisis. On top of internal incompetence by government officials, a multi-year drought, the worst China has seen in years, threatens to topple the country's already COVID-pummeled economy. Water has always been a big factor to look out for in China, and that is more apparent now than ever. According to the United Nations, though China is home to 21% of the world's population, it contains only 7% of the world's fresh water supplies. Ironically, most of these water supplies are located in southern China and not in its northern part where most of the population lives. At first, this might seem like a minuscule problem. It's just water after all, one might say. But as a former British diplomat and China expert Charlie Part noted in 2018, China can print money, but they can't print water. It's either you have it or you don't. And, well, China doesn't have it. This is quite a problem for a nation that currently consumes 10 billion barrels of water per day. For comparison's sake, this is about 700 times its daily oil consumption. Yeah, let that sink in. One could arguably say water has been the silent hero behind China's decades of explosive economic growth, as it is essential for growing food, generating energy, and sustaining humanity. With as big an industrial sector as China has, this shortage of water is slowing down the economy and resulting in the closure of essential plants all over the nation. All this will serve to lower the forecasts on China's already meager growth predictions, further pushing the country into a full-blown recession. Now, with the drought and heat wave in full force, not only China but the United States and the rest of the world are likely to feel the effects of China's troubles. This is because, as the rivers and lakes dry out and the heat wave continues, that condition is going to have a significant effect on China's food and power production. Moreover, given China's scale as the second largest global power, this situation could also induce global food and industrial materials shortages on a far greater scale than we've ever seen in recent times. Given the country's overriding importance to the global economy, potential water-driven disruptions beginning in China would rapidly reverberate through food, energy, and material markets around the world and create economic and political turbulence for years to come. So yes, even you in the United States might end up being affected by Chinese droughts. To make the situation worse, the underground water supply simply can't help the thirsty population. A 2018 analysis of surface water by China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment found that 19% was classified as unfit for human consumption, and roughly 7% was unfit for any use at all. The quality of groundwater, which is critical for ensuring water supplies during droughts like the one China is currently facing, is worse. Over 30% of China's underground water is deemed unfit for human consumption, and 16% is deemed unfit for any use at all. Data from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization indicates that China uses nearly 2.5 times as much fertilizer and 4 times as much pesticides as the United States does, despite having 25% less arable land. A new study finds chemicals are often used inefficiently on small farms in China. Land and migration policies may help explain why the country uses 30% of the world's fertilizers and pesticides on 9% of global cropland. This could potentially have played a role in polluting their underground reservoirs. Where the CCP falls at fault is that for decades, Beijing has generally chosen to conceal the full extent of China's environmental problems to limit potential public backlash. In avoiding questions relating to their competence, the CCP has let the country fall into ruin. This lack of transparency, on top of droughts that China now faces, has resulted in the current mess. When we look at this water crisis scenario, it presents itself as 2 large problems in one. What makes it worse is that they spill from China's borders to the whole world. Let's run through them.
This year, extreme heat has severely damaged crops in India. Crop yields are falling globally, and there are more dire predictions.
Nearly 830 million people around the world went hungry in 2021. That's up nearly 50 million the year before.
Scorched, you see, certainly cannot grow. The high temperature is slowly roasting the sweet potato leaves to death.
China is taking emergency action, but the leaves and stems continue to die.
The first and most obvious problem that is likely to be faced is there's going to be a food crisis in the absence of water resources. A quick look into Chinese history reveals that famines due to droughts have helped topple at least 5 of China's 17 dynasties. This is because hunger and food shortages tend to remove whatever inhibitors people may have. Fully aware of this, the CCP has heavily emphasized maximizing grain production to ensure food security. This has resulted in policies where the government incentivizes farmers to maximize the production of corn, rice, and wheat to achieve self-sufficiency levels. The problem is, to sustain these harvests, farms and cities are pumping water far faster than nature can replenish it. Satellite data suggests that each year between 2003 and 2010, North China lost an amount of groundwater equal to more than twice of what Beijing consumes annually. And yes, that's a lot of water. As groundwater levels fall, many farmers are struggling to find new resources. Some are digging larger, deeper wells, often at a great cost. But continual overdraws may render water physically inaccessible, regardless of the pumper's willingness to spend on deeper wells and new pumping technology. Add to that the fact that underground water in China is contaminated and unsuitable, and the problem becomes even bigger. This could lead to a whole food crisis. Statistics show that if the North China Plain were to suffer a 33% crop loss because of water insufficiency, China would potentially need to compensate by importing approximately 20% of the world's internationally traded corn and 13% of its traded wheat. Typically, this would cause an imbalance in food imports globally, but such a scenario is not out of the realm of possibility, considering that a drought in early 2022 slashed Argentina's expected corn crop by 33%. To add to the problems, if the Chinese drought increases and affects the rice yields in southern China or Heilongjiang, it could create even larger market shocks given China's disproportionate share of rice consumption. And this is particularly so because all 3 major staple grains are critical for hundreds of millions of lower-income consumers worldwide. In previous videos, I've covered how China is already hoarding a large amount of the world's grain supply. If the water crisis and the drought persist, however, even with their stores, China could still be subjected to a multi-year yield shortfall. Such a scenario would result in China increasing its imports of grain from the global markets. As we witnessed when they hoarded the grain they now already have, such an action could trigger food price spikes in high-income countries. This would lead to shortages in those countries, resulting in widespread hunger globally. Also, as China buys up reserves to compensate for the shortfalls at home, they will render a lot of basics inaccessible to hundreds of millions of people in poorer countries, who can't afford a global food price war. As I've mentioned before, though the drought is in China and the water crisis is a failure on the CCP's part, the effects of this are going to be global. With China focusing on the preservation of its people, it seems the world is the one that is going to foot the bill for China's misfortunes, in particular, the poorer countries in the world. Furthermore, China's water crisis isn't only limited to its agricultural sector. No. It reaches beyond to affect other sectors as well, maybe even in a bigger capacity. Let's take a look at that.
The provinces in China's northeast are suffering some of the country's worst power cuts, with cities plunged into darkness lasting hours.
Shanghai is switching off the lights along its famous Bund riverfront.
Power crunch in some parts of China has shut down factories and left some households without electricity.
Factories that are suppliers to companies like Tesla, big polysilicon makers for solar panels, big lithium battery makers for EVs, they've had to reduce or shut down production because of this.
China has the largest energy sector in the world. With the kind of population China has and the size of its industrial sector, this doesn't come as a surprise. The challenge is that a lot of this power is hydroelectric, meaning they capitalize on the larger quantities of water to generate electricity. Even the other stations that take advantage of nuclear power also require water to cool reactor cores and used fuel rods. This is why almost all the Chinese power stations are built on banks of large water bodies, or at least somewhere close where they can easily access large water quantities. Now, with the rivers and lakes drying up due to the drought, most of these power stations have been forced to shut down, as they can no longer operate. Amidst the mortgage, property, and Taiwan crisis, this is only serving to show the weakness of the CCP. If China keeps closing down factories, and it loses just 15% of its hydropower production in a year because of low water levels behind dams, it would have to increase electricity output by an equal amount to what Egypt generates in a year to compensate. The only way to do that would be to use coal-fired plants. This will have the intended short-term effects, but in the long run, it will roll back their environmental progress and further increase the same contamination that has ruined their underground receivers. Oh, and did I mention just how water-intensive coal mining is? And you really can't have a running coal plant with limited coal, now can you? It's a losing situation however you look at it. This reduction in power output in China has the citizens feeling the brunt of the impact the most. This is causing anger, because amidst a heat wave, the government has chosen to limit electricity supply to the masses and even close factories like those of Toyota. People can barely use air conditioning systems. Beijing has, however, given special preferences to Tesla by allowing them to continue operating at capacity at the expense of their citizens. Something that the people aren't too happy about.
We cannot live through this summer without air conditioning.
Yeah, it's hot as hell. I'm melting.
It could affect residents and those that need to use the water.
Power crunch in some parts of China has shut down factories.
China does not have enough power to keep its factories running.
How did Tesla manage to get what it wanted in terms of its foray into China?
Wanted to be at the forefront of electric vehicles, made China more willing to negotiate with Tesla and to give them their turn.
When you consider that, at present, China is by far the world's largest producer of aluminum, ferrosilicon, lead, manganese, magnesium, zinc, most rare earth materials, and many other specialty metals and materials, you will see that there is an incoming problem. Power outages in even a single region can move global markets, a fact that Europe car makers discovered in late 2021 when power shortages curtailed magnesium smelter operations in Shanxi province, responsible for about 50% of global output. As magnesium inventories plummeted, prices spiked to 7 times their normal level at the beginning of the year, causing global problems in supply. Now, with all these key components at risk of a limited supply due to China's problems, there are likely going to be global supply chain challenges, as industrial facilities account for over 65% of electricity use in China. Blackouts by decree would disrupt several key material supplies, as we have already begun to see with the closure of factories. It is setting itself up as quite the great pending global catastrophe. Chinese officials are not oblivious to the direness of the disaster they have on their hands. The government, back in 2003, even launched the $60 billion South to North Water Transfer Project, which draws water from tributaries of the Yangtze River to replenish the dry north. This was part of a scheme to draw water from the south of China, where most of the freshwater supplies are, to bring it to northern China, where most of the population lives. In addition, they've also deployed aircrafts and rockets to lace clouds with silver iodide, or liquid nitrogen, a process known as cloud seeding to boost rainfall. Other measures like relocating heavy industry away from the most water-stressed regions, along with massive investments in water management infrastructure, have been taken as well. In April of this year, the Vice Minister of Water Resources, Wei Xianxiong, estimated that annual investment in water-related projects could hit $100 billion. This shows the kind of effort that is being put into trying to solve the problem. However, in the face of the drought being faced, all this seems to be for naught. The harsh truth is that China's potential way out of this predicament is bounded by harsh economic, physical, and political realities. Economic solutions like the desalinization of water are proving too expensive, with very little to show for it. Physical solutions like the transfer of water from the south to the north are nigh impossible and also very expensive. Maybe above all of this, the CCP wants to protect its political power and image. Certain measures, though potentially effective, if they harm the CCP's preferred narrative of economic progress, are completely ruled out. At some point, the lines between maintaining power and actually improving citizens' lives are blurred. The whole world now waits to see what becomes of China's situation. And if the situation persists, then it will be clear that the rest of the world is on a deadline too. India isn't too fond of China's actions around its borders.
June last year, China provoked India. It attacked Indian soldiers in Galwan. 20 Indian soldiers were killed in action. For the first time since the 1980s, blood was shed on the India-China border.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi says his country is hurt and angry following Monday's border clash with Chinese troops, in which at least 20 Indian soldiers were killed. Each side blames the other for the violence, the deadliest clash in the disputed Himalayan border region in 4 decades.
The country at this point of time is caught in a crisis over a surveillance ship that's been sent by China. The ship in question here is Yuan Wang 5. It's a high-tech Chinese tracking vessel. But within days, India expressed a lot of concern about the presence of a Chinese ship being allowed to dock in Hambantota.
India isn't letting China just push its weight around. Much like China, India is strong and growing quickly on the world stage. Now both nations are face to face, fighting over humankind's most basic need: water. China is building infrastructure to dry up one of India's largest rivers in an attempt to slow down the nation, while India is taking steps to eliminate this risk. All this is creating tensions that could boil into dangerous conflicts between the two superpowers. These conflicts are becoming so severe that we might see the groundwork for a potential war being laid out. A war that, if not stopped, could drag the entire world with it, forcing the potential of a nuclear winter. So, how did we go from needing water to arming rockets? Well, in today's video, I'll explain that. I'll get into what exactly China is doing, its motives, and the vast implications this has for world peace.
China into a global economic powerhouse, second in GDP only to the United States. China seems to leave everyone else behind.
India's GDP grew by 13.5% in the first quarter of this financial year, the fastest since 2021. Better than the world, it's an impressive first quarter, much better than other major economies.
Expected to still see its economy grow by about 8.4%. That would really be one of the best growth rates in the world. So China is recovering much quicker than most of the rest of the world.
India has managed to not get adversely affected. This is no mean achievement given the population and the size of our country.
A few weeks ago, I made an extensive video talking about the water crisis that China is facing. For those who haven't seen it, feel free to check it out in the link in the description below. But let me summarize it all right now. China is facing one of the most severe global cases of a water crisis. As the droughts intensify, water is becoming more scarce. And it's not just the drought that has caused this. China's vast population and vast quantities of water needed for agricultural, domestic, and industrial use are taking a toll on the nation. When you factor in the fact that almost the entire population of China lives in the northern part of the country, which is very barren, while the available water resources are mostly in the southern regions, you begin to understand why this is a crisis. But the woes do not end there. Apart from the direct usage of water, China relies quite significantly on hydroelectric power to generate electricity. It goes without saying that China's energy needs are immense. You do not become the manufacturing hub of the world without a dependency on energy, now do ya? If you keep doing this elementary math and adding 1 + 1, you can see how a water crisis can also turn into an energy crisis, and together that can become a food crisis. Quite the chain, isn't it? Well, the overall point I'm making is that water is important to China. And by this same logic, you can see how the unavailability of water in any nation can trigger a food crisis and send a nation spiraling. This is why nations guard their water resources, because, well, he who controls the water can control a nation. It is the knowledge of that realization that brings us into the India-China conflict. Now, before I jump into China's brutality, please take a minute to like this video. Covering war topics is always a little risky on YouTube, but your likes have been helping me a lot in terms of the YouTube algorithm. All right, back to it. In a bid to ease its own burden, China is addressing some of its water and energy needs. However, it's coming at a cost. What's the cost, you ask? Well, India, Bangladesh, and a few other Asian countries. Yes, nations are the price. Let me explain. This right here is the Brahmaputra River. It's an 1,800-mile-long river that begins in China's southwest Tibet region, where it is known as the Yarlung Tsangpo. From there, it continues and enters India in the mountainous, remote northeastern state of Arunachal Pradesh, where it is also called the Siang. It then descends into the plains of adjoining Assam state and ends in Bangladesh in the Bay of Bengal. This one river, known by many names as it stretches across 3 nations, is a life source for hundreds of millions of farmers and residents. That is to say, nothing of the environmental benefit of something so large and grand. So where does the conflict fit into all of this? Well, China began to build a hydroelectric dam on the river in a bid to generate power. They did this in Gyaka, a county in Tibet. And yes, even though Tibet is supposedly an autonomous region, everyone and their grandmother knows that the firm hand of the CCP runs things there. Now, if China built one hydroelectric plant to provide energy for the 23,000 or so residents that reside there, it would be okay. In terms of energy output, that would be more than sufficient. However, to date, China has built not 1, not 2, but 4 hydroelectric plants in Gyaka. These are Dagu, which has an output of 640 megawatts, Xiacha, which outputs 320 megawatts, Jiasu, which outputs 560 megawatts, and Zhangmu, with 510 megawatts. Now, why would China want 4 superstations, all within kilometers of each other, all in the same low population density area? It's not like these stations are powering Beijing or anything. Well, when you factor in the fact that these hydroelectric stations are built upstream, and they take away from the water pressure and the water quantities that then channel down to India and Bangladesh, you quickly realize where the problem is. China has built unnecessary power stations to power a small city just to inflict pain on India. Or, well, that's what the optics look like, at the very least. That's not all, however. Right before the part of the river that turns to enter India, yes, this part, China made plans to build additional dams, 3 of them actually. These are Pangsum, Liangsai, and Niang. So let's run through this again. Right on the river stream that feeds into India, China has built 4 mega hydroelectric power stations and 3 dams. Yikes. You can understand why India is causing a ruckus. India is also not just fussing over hypotheticals either, no. There is a mountain of proof that the infrastructure that has been built is impacting the lower reaches of the waterway in India. This is evidenced by the simple and direct fact that the water levels in the Brahmaputra are plunging. In February of this year, 2 vessels from Bangladesh got stranded in the river as the water levels dropped. 2 dredgers were used to pull out the vessel. Now, I'm no judge, but it seems pretty clear-cut. There's a cause, there's an effect, and well, there's the regular old CCP. 4 stations and 3 dams, merely kilometers from each other, are a big factor to consider. But it's not the only fact to consider when you're looking at India being disgruntled. Remember when I said that most people live in northern China where it's dry, while most water sources are in southern China? Well, the CCP knows this, and back in 2003 they launched the $60 billion north-to-south water transfer project. This was a project aimed at drawing water from tributaries of the Yangtze River to replenish the dry north. This was part of a scheme to draw water from the south of China, where most of the freshwater supplies are, and to bring it to northern China, where most of the population lives. Bringing it to the present, the Brahmaputra River is a victim of this ambitious Chinese project. You see, Chinese engineers are testing techniques that could be used to build 1,000-kilometer tunnels, the world's longest, to carry water from Tibet to Xinjiang, a barren region in northwest China. Remember, the Brahmaputra River originates in Tibet, where it's called the Yarlung-Tsangpo River. It's from here that China plans to divert water to its northern regions. India has taken a firm stance against this action. If water is diverted from the upstream Brahmaputra, then by the time it gets to the actual Brahmaputra in India, there will be nothing but a trickle. Again, there is evidence of this as the water levels are already dropping. Hundreds of millions of farmers and residents who depend on that river will be left in pretty dire situations. There will be hunger strikes in India, which, given its population, will cause a huge uproar. Bangladesh will also be a victim of this as well, given that the river passes through that nation too. Basically, China's actions are punishing India and Bangladesh in a very severe manner. This is something that India, they're not going to stand for. India has had disputes with China in the past, something you can go over in depth in this video I made before. You can find the link in the description. One thing that all previous China-India border disputes show is that India is not afraid to become militant if the need arises.
And in breaking news coming in from India, where an intrusion by Chinese troops led to clashes between troops of both the countries, Indian Army foiled the attempt which happened 3 days back. The PLA tried to intrude. Injuries have been reported on both the sides. The clash comes amidst the 9th round of military talks between India and China.
No shots were fired, but soldiers clashed and died. There are claims brutal, basic weapons were used. Two nuclear powers were in hand-to-hand combat, and both blame the other.
When this new threat of robbing India of water results in the suffering and death of millions in India, you can be certain that their response is not going to be gentle. It will be swift and strong. As journalists, one of the things we make sure to do is to maintain a level of impartiality, and this includes giving the benefit of the doubt to all parties. However, in a case like this, where China builds 4 power stations that are within kilometers of each other, 3 large dams, and begins to divert water from the very source of one of the primary rivers in India, well, it becomes hard to defend that action. China and India do not have any water-sharing treaties, just a hydrological data sharing pact from 2018. This means that, in theory, China feels it has the freedom to do as it pleases. But this is not something that India will let stand. Beijing has denied the allegations of causing harm to India, and through China's foreign ministry, spokesman Hong Lei has released a statement saying, "Our projects have not affected the lower stream regions, including those in India." Indian officials, on the other hand, are not buying this, with a local Indian state lawmaker, Tako Dabai, on record saying, "We suspect the sudden drying up of the Siang, the Brahmaputra, could be a result of China either diverting the river water on their side or due to some artificial blockades somewhere in the upper reaches." To protect its own interests, in addition to putting pressure on Beijing, India has begun considering a plan to build a 10 gigawatts hydropower project in a remote eastern state following the news report suggesting that China could construct even more dams on a section of the Brahmaputra River. The primary motivator for this is that Indian authorities are concerned that the Chinese projects could trigger flash floods or create water scarcity. And therefore, as a countermeasure, they have floated the idea to build the dam, which could help avoid any possibility of a drought in the region. Basically, it helps in aiding their cause and does not leave them entirely at the mercy of China's kindness. The reality of the matter is that China's continued actions will have devastating effects on India and Bangladesh. All those actions happening upstream of the river will no doubt cripple the things that are happening downstream. If China keeps ignoring India's pleas and warnings, what will happen is the same thing that has always happened between the two nations when it comes to border control. military conflict. Neither India nor China is a pushover, and any military conflict can easily have grave consequences. Whether the Brahmaputra will be the spark for war between the two nations is yet to be seen. But in the interest of peace, it is the hope of this journalist that matters don't devolve into that. As I mentioned earlier, war topics are not treated kindly by the YouTube algorithm. In fact, some of my previous videos were demonetized, so let's hope this one doesn't meet the same fate. And that's why I launched a Patreon where you guys can support the videos. Please check it out by clicking the link in the description. This is China, and these are the neighbors China has, or had, border issues with in recent history. Yes, it's a lot. US-China relations have not been the best, to say the least. China is the biggest threat to America's throne as an economic superpower, and America is the biggest threat to China's authoritarian regime. But America isn't the only country that China isn't friendly with. It has many territorial disputes with its neighbors. These include some big superpowers like India and Japan, and also relatively small neutral countries like Bhutan and Nepal. In total, China has some form of a territorial dispute with 19 of its neighbors. And the problems don't stop there. The list of China's allies is short and thin, while the list of its enemies is long and growing. So this begs the question, why does China have so many enemies? To address this question, we'll start by looking at the land disputes that it has with its neighbors, and then we'll move into the naval problems it has in its region. In addressing these problems, maybe we'll have the clarity to understand the modern motivations of the country in picking so many fights on so many fronts. Also, please be sure to hit that like button. Our recent videos have been getting suppressed by YouTube, and so your likes help out a lot in terms of the YouTube algorithm.
India has claimed
20 of its soldiers have been killed by Chinese troops.
Indian Prime Minister says his country is hurt and angry.
The Chinese diplomats have been quite vocal. They've even asked India to discipline its military.
This is the first deadly clash on this border in 45 years.
The deadliest in 4 decades.
The first nation on our list is a unique one because, well, China has beef with a country that considers cows sacred. We cannot talk about land disputes that China has with its neighbors without first mentioning India. India has been one of China's biggest pains for decades. As India grows, exerting more influence on the global stage, so too does its rivalry with China. A huge part of this rivalry comes from China's ongoing disagreement with India over its land border in the Himalayas. Basically, the India-China border can be broken down into 2 major contested sectors. The first is this western sector that comprises the Aksai Chin region. This region was originally part of the state of Jammu, and Kashmir is claimed by China as part of its autonomous Xinjiang region. After the 1962 war, when China defeated India, the land was administered by China. It is the second largest Indo-China border area, covering over 38,000 square kilometers. However, it's all uninhabited land. While India claims the entire Aksai Chin territory as well as the Shaksgam Valley, which was Indian territory gifted to China by Pakistan, China contests Indian control over Daulat Beg Oldi, a tehsil in Leh, south of Aksai Chin, that is believed to host the world's highest airstrip. Another area of contention is this eastern sector that comprises the Arunachal Pradesh region. China claims this land to be its own, and it is the largest disputed area, covering around 90,000 square kilometers. It was formerly called Far East Frontier Agency. During the 1962 war, the People's Liberation Army occupied it, but they announced a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew, respecting the international boundary, also called the McMahon Line. However, they have continued to assert their claim over the territory. Nowadays, almost the whole of Arunachal is claimed by China, much to the bitterness of India. What makes all this contested borderland tricky is that the land has rivers, lakes, and snowcaps along the frontier, meaning that the line can shift, which causes further tension between India and China. Basically, each country claims the land is theirs, and this fuels tension. Clashes and confrontations of the land have happened several times throughout history in years like 1962, 1967, 2011, 2017, and more recently in 2020. As the two nations continue to build infrastructure along the border in competition, for example, India's construction of a new road to a high-altitude airbase, severe confrontations occur between the patrolling troops on their side. The last altercation in 2020 was particularly significant because it was the first time in very modern history that deaths occurred over the border dispute. Indian media reported that at least 20 Indian soldiers had been ambushed and killed by over 300 Chinese soldiers. It was reported that they were clubbed to death by bats that had metal spikes, barbed wire, and nails. An Indian army officer said, even unarmed men who fled to the hillside were hunted down and killed. More skirmishes have occurred in the area, with some reports involving gunfire, although no gun casualties have been reported. The prospect of all-out war remains a possibility, and with tensions already high, little is needed to trigger it. Thus far, the two countries have fought only one war, in 1962, when India suffered a humiliating defeat, and China seems to be convinced of its maintained superiority over India. However, now a war would be devastating, as both sides are established nuclear powers. As you all know, no one wins in a nuclear war. In addition to that, the economic fallout would be massive, as China remains one of India's biggest trading partners despite the conflicts. One thing is certain, neither Indian Prime Minister Modi nor Chinese President Xi Jinping will admit defeat and cede this borderland. And until that happens, tensions are bound to remain high, and the prospect of war remains high with it. Another source of conflict that China has is its land dispute with Bhutan. The border between the two nations spans approximately 500 kilometers and has been the site of several territorial disputes. The western section of the boundary was first established during the 19th century between the British and Chinese governments and goes along various mountain ridges. However, the exact contention area on the borders remains unclear and obscure. This, of course, has not helped to solve the issue, and that has served as a significant factor in the onset of many of the territorial disputes between the Bhutanese and Chinese governments to date. Both nations have, over the past few decades, asserted their various claims and arguments towards the ownership of the land. But this has not gone very far. This is primarily because the disputes themselves are not even coherent. For example, the Bhutanese government contends that there exists 4 contested areas along the border, while China argues that there are 6 areas of dispute. Over the years, tensions surrounding the borders have risen, with the dispute over the Dak Lam region escalating into a standoff between Chinese and Indian forces in 2017. The area became the site of a standoff between the armed forces of India and China following an attempt by China to extend a road coming via Sinchle further southward on the Dak Lam Plateau. India does not have a claim on Dak Lam, but it supports Bhutan's claim on the territory. This is mainly because Dak Lam lies adjacent to India's Sikkim region, which is a crucial strategic area for the Indian military. Continued Chinese encroachment into Dak Lam prompted the Indian government to respond with the deployment of troops near the disputed area. Diplomatic efforts have de-escalated the situation, but it's still a very hot topic. With India supporting Bhutan's land claims, this creates a lot of tension in the area. Tensions that can easily turn into armed conflict. This is an outcome that no one wants, but the Chinese Communist Party, along with President Xi Jinping, is not willing to move a single inch. One can only wonder what the diplomatic talks that have been ongoing since the 1980s will achieve in ending this decades-long dispute. Talk about overcooked beef.
It is targeting the Tibetans.
The territory has been closed and controlled by Beijing.
China's state media often comments on Tibet, pointing out that it has always been part of China long before Hawaii became part of the United States.
And that the Dalai Lama
has long been a thorn in the flesh of the Chinese government.
The spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism who fled Tibet in 1959.
Beijing openly calls him a jackal in monk's robes
These 50 years have brought untold suffering and destruction to the land and people of Tibet. Today, religion, culture, language, and identity are nearing extinction. In short, the Tibetan people are regarded as criminals deserving to be put to death. However, the fact that the Tibet issue is alive and the international community is taking a growing interest in it is indeed an achievement. I have no doubt that the justice of Tibet's cause will prevail if we continue to tread the path of truth and nonviolence. These are the heartbreaking words of the 14th Dalai Lama, said back in 2009. Of the many land disputes that China has as it continues to make several enemy states, this is perhaps the saddest and most egregious. Unlike the other disputes, we've talked about various sections of borderland. With Tibet, the whole country has been illegally annexed. Back in 1950, China enforced a long-held claim on the Himalayan country and incorporated it into its own territory forcefully. The Tibetans tried to resist, launching an unsuccessful uprising in 1959 that resulted in Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, fleeing to India where he set up a government in exile. He resides there to this day. To this day, Tibetans say theirs was an independent society and they were never a part of China, while the Chinese say Tibet had always been a part of China. They have been illegally occupying the land for several decades now, in a move that has been condemned by several countries, including the United States. In advocating for Tibetan rights, U.S. Texas Representative Michael McCall has been on record saying, "The Chinese Communist Party's invasion of Tibet in 1950 and its repression of Tibetans ever since set the stage for the CCP's ongoing territorial aggression and human rights atrocities. Their attempts to steal people's freedoms and rewrite history continue to threaten American values and our national security interests today." To date, Tibet is rated as the least free country in the world, as a result of the Chinese occupation and oppression of its people. China is not likely to release Tibet from its grip, with them having committed egregious crimes such as kidnapping Tibet's spiritual leaders in a bid to appoint their own puppets. Under China's occupation, Tibet has been divided up, renamed, and incorporated into Chinese provinces, with little reference to the original borders between Tibet's provinces. What China has done in Tibet is a disgusting act of oppression that hardly anyone can argue for. But hey, that's just another regular day, according to the CCP. Despite the severity of the issues we've discussed, China has no shortage of problems with its other smaller country neighbors. China has long had disputes with Nepal, its neighbor, over claims that parts of Nepal are Tibet. This has escalated in recent years, with China annexing Rui village in Nepal, claiming it as part of Tibet. Further reports suggest that China keeps encroaching on Nepal's territory. Laos is another victim of China's aggressive expansionist policy, as the communist country also alleges that it owns large parts of Laos on historical precedent dating back to the Yuan dynasty. These claims make China aggressive, and because of its might, it threatens to push around Laos to get what it wants. Mongolia is yet another victim of China's border disputes. As much as the Mongolian government has not been involved, Inner Mongolia, an autonomous region within Mongolia, has also been involved in territorial disputes with China. The last border flare-up between the two regions was as recent as 2015. This dispute is not nationalized and is regarded more as internal affairs between regions, but knowing the CCP, their fingerprints are all over that. Possibly the last land border dispute we'll discuss is the Myanmar one. The two countries share a 2,185-kilometer-long border based on a 1960 agreement. However, in 2020, Myanmar began to accuse China of creating trouble on the border and instigating terror groups. This is a scary accusation to level, and one can only wonder how far deep the scheming of the CCP in taking land over from Myanmar will go. China's aggressive expansionist policies aren't just land disputes, but naval ones too.
in the South China Sea.
South China Sea, the hotly contested body of water.
The 9-dash line delimits the ownership of the islands of the South China Sea are China's inherent territory.
China has conflicting territorial relations with
borders of these South China Sea countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia.
Chinese vessels are fanning out across waters.
Japanese media has also reported that Chinese Coast Guard ships entered the country's territorial waters for a second day in a row.
The Philippines and China have dispute over the area in the South China Sea. In particular, the two countries are sparring over the Scarborough Reef and the Spratly Islands. While China has offered to negotiate, the Philippines has said these territories are non-negotiable and have always been a part of their country. The problem comes in that basically China has claimed the entirety of the South China Sea, which overlaps with the West Philippine Sea. The issue got heated to the point that the Philippines took China to court and scored a victory against them in the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, the Netherlands, in 2016. The arbitration court declared Beijing's claim over nearly the entire South China Sea as illegal. However, in typical CCP fashion, China refused to recognize the 2016 arbitral ruling. The United States has openly come out backing the Philippines in this, with the U.S. Embassy in Manila last year releasing a statement saying, "We stand with the Philippines, our oldest treaty ally in Asia." The U.S. Embassy also accused China of using maritime militia to intimidate, provoke, and threaten other nations, which undermines peace and security in the region. In November of last year, Chinese vessels had blocked and used water cannons on two Philippine supply boats that were heading to a disputed shoal occupied by Filipino Marines in the South China Sea. The hostility, which triggered an angry protest from Manila, was the latest flare-up in the South China Sea, with China claiming virtually the entire waterway. The truth is that Manila is facing a deadlock in a dispute that it cannot resolve alone. And while an armed conflict directly involving the Philippines is unlikely, there remains a growing potential for incidents at sea to escalate. And if China is allowed to take what it wants, who knows how far that entitlement will go. China and Japan have also repeatedly clashed over a group of uninhabited islands called the Senkaku Islands in Tokyo, the Diaoyu Islands in Beijing, and the Taoyutai Islands in Taiwan. These are all various collections of clustered several small island groups. China began raising questions of sovereignty over the islands in the 1970s when evidence of oil reserves in the region surfaced. As is typical for a nation seeking resources, they started to make a move on them only to be opposed by Japan. For some years, Beijing has been aggravating tensions by increasing the presence of the China Coast Guard in vessels in the contiguous zone of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Though the threat of war has not broken out over these islands, the two superpowers generally deliver stiff warnings to each other when either superpower oversteps. And to add to the list of its enemies, China has Vietnam as well. The disputes it has with the nation lie in conflicts surrounding the South China Sea. For years now, China and Vietnam have long faced maritime territorial disputes over these Spratly Islands and the Pericel Islands. China used the general claim that these islands, which are a large part of Vietnam, belong to it because they are in the South China Sea, and that sea belongs to them. So deeply rooted in this reasoning, the Chinese army sank a Vietnamese fishing vessel near Vanguard Bank, prompting Vietnam to lodge an official protest. When it comes to the South China Sea, China is being a bully due to the military influence it has over these smaller nations. Malaysia and China have been fighting primarily over the Spratly Islands. In April of 2020, Chinese maritime militia vessels started shadowing West Capella, a Malaysian drill ship conducting exploration activities off the country's coast. When China dismissed Malaysia's objections, US and Australian warships entered the disputed waters. The Chinese vessels eventually left the sea, The claim that the South China Sea and all of its islands are China's is what is fueling all these conflicts in that region. In 2019, Malaysia summoned China's ambassador after 16 military aircraft flew over disputed waters off its eastern state of Sarawak. Malaysia's foreign ministry said at the time that the maneuver was a serious threat to national sovereignty. China's brazenness has not gone unnoticed. Over the last decade, Beijing has adopted an increasingly assertive posture towards Malaysia's territory in the South China Sea. Dating back to 2013, even a Chinese Coast Guard ship has been stationed near Luconia Breakers, an area about 80 nautical miles south of Sarawak. If this does not scream intimidation, I don't really know what does. And due to China's reasoning adopted for convenience in the South China Sea, the communist nation has several other strained relations with countries in the region. These include Indonesia, North Korea, and Brunei. The reasoning is much like the countries mentioned. In trying to dominate and protect its military interests in the South China Sea, the CCP has only served to create enemies for itself, enemies who have allied with the US government, China's rival. The very fear that drove them to expansionist policies have been realized primarily because of those same policies. Quite the irony, if I do say so myself. One major border dispute that I did not talk about in this video was the Taiwan one. This is likely one most people know about due to recent tensions that grabbed worldwide attention not too long ago. Not to worry, however. I skipped over it because I made an extensive video about that matter a few weeks back. Please feel free to check this video out for a better understanding of the matter with in-depth knowledge of the roots of the conflict. The link to the video will be in the description below. At this point, one has to wonder why China is deliberately creating enemies for itself with an aggressive expansionist policy that has no place in modern times. Well, the reason for this might actually surprise you. As evidenced by the several conflicts that China has started, or at the very least is continuing on several fronts, one can see that the communist nation has taken the role of the aggressor. China has assumed the role of an aggressive, autocratic superpower that has little respect for the rules-based international order. It has amassed enough economic, military, and soft power to impose a new geopolitical and geoeconomic order where its interests will be eternally paramount. Accordingly, China has set about creating a new space for itself by trampling on the interests of other nations. Just like in these border disputes, China has little regard for other nations, just their own interests. To be frank, China uses its economic prowess, the world's second largest, as a weapon to secure its political objectives and bully countries that criticize its policies. I believe that this overshowing of dominance is an overcompensation technique. On the ground, China has so many internal issues that are rocking it from the inside. Some have been going on for years, like the COVID-19 pandemic mismanagement, and some have heightened in the past years and months, like the real estate and economic crisis that's facing the nation. On top of that, China has food and water crisis, and all this just adds to civil unrest. All these problems have resulted in the CCP receiving a lot of criticism from its own citizens. To maintain stability at home, the CCP, through targeted propaganda, tries to unite the nation behind a rallying outside enemy or cause. This has resulted in its overly aggressive foreign expansionist policy. Of course, this is not the only reason for China's actions. Its desperation to secure the oil present in the South China Sea plays a role in it too, but I believe the distraction all this provides is probably the main motivator. To divert attention from all of these internal issues, China is creating trouble along its borders, be it on the LAC with India or other countries in the South China Sea. If nothing else, the CCP and President Xi are conniving and would rather watch the regions burn than give up political power. It is this hunger for power and control that has resulted in China's aggressiveness towards most of its neighbors in the region. If left unchecked, who knows how far the CCP will take this? I leave you with a question, and you can comment with your responses below. As the world's leading superpower, and potentially the only country that might dwarf China's own, do you believe the US should step in as an ally and protect these other countries whose territory China is encroaching on? If you think they should, comment why. And if you think they shouldn't, well, comment why not.